Okay, don't worry. Thank you.
Good afternoon and good evening to all our distinguished participants. On behalf of ESCAP and UN Women, we are pleased to welcome you back to this virtual expert group meeting on implementing Beijing+25 commitments in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. We had a full day yesterday, and we are looking forward to taking further discussions today in 2 substantive sessions, followed by wrapping up conclusions and recommendations session. I will hand over shortly the floor to our moderator for this first session, but firstly, just to remind you kindly from yesterday to facilitate your participation in the session discussions and to ensure other participants the opportunity to engage effectively, we would kindly request that you use the Zoom chat function during the session presentations to write in any questions, comments that you may have or wish to flag for the attention of the session moderator, indicating if to one of the speakers to whom the question or comment is being addressed. We kindly request that you please make your questions, comments brief and succinct, and that you include your full name and affiliation. In view of the limited time for this meeting and the large number of participants, we kindly ask for your understanding that all participants may not be able to take the floor. Please do rest assured that all participants, that all your questions and your commentaries submitted in the chat box will be considered, both for the attention of the moderators and speakers' attention during the sessions, as well as in the meeting report that we will issue after the meeting. And finally, we will share a link to our evaluation during and after the meeting in this chat box, and we would very much appreciate you taking your time to complete this short questionnaire. Thank you very much. Now we will be moving on to session 3, addressing violence against women. It is being moderated by our UN Woman colleague, Melissa Alvarado. Ms. Alvarado is the Ending Violence Against Women Regional Program Manager at UN Women Asia Pacific Regional Office. She has more than 20 years of experience working specifically on this issue, addressing child abuse, particularly multidisciplinary approaches to prevention and investigation of child sexual abuse and fatalities. She is from the United States and holds a master's degree in social work and a bachelor's degree in psychology. Her work is informed by years of experience advocating for and directly supporting survivors of violence against women and children in crisis. And we are very privileged to have her with us this morning to moderate this upcoming session. Melissa, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chana, and thank you to colleagues and the organizers of this event, this very important event this morning. I wish you all a good morning, and a good morning to the distinguished panelists, participants, and colleagues who are joining us today. It is really a great pleasure and an honor to welcome you to this session on addressing violence against women during this online expert group meeting today. We have 4 panelists who will be highlighting critical issues regarding ending violence against women and girls, as noted in the Asia Pacific Beijing+25 Declaration and Report established last year, as well as lessons that we have all been learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. We will then have time for discussion between panel members and participants on this topic. So I'm going to walk us through a few slides to introduce us to the panel members and to this session. So if I could have next slide, please. In the agenda for today's session, we will have a quick introduction of the speakers, and I will do a very brief introduction and very quick intervention on the topic. We will have an opening presentation by Ms. Banda Narana. We'll have presentations from the panel, and then we'll have the interactive discussion. We will have closing remarks, a few closing remarks, and then we'll close the session by 10:30 local time, Bangkok time. So we're here for 90 minutes. Next slide, please. As my colleague has just mentioned, because we are meeting online, we ask and we're trying to assure the best connection for everyone. We kindly request that participants keep microphones on mute and cameras turned off during the presentations if you're not speaking. Please note that the meeting proceedings will be recorded, and we do encourage your participation. If you have any problems with audio, visual, please do contact our colleague Chukyat with the email listed below. So I request that all the panel members turn on their video at this time. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Bandana Rana, who's Vice Chair of the UN CEDAW Committee. Ms. Bandana Rana is from Nepal. She's the Vice Chair of the UN CEDAW Committee. Her experience spans 3 decades of promoting women's rights, gender equality, and peace and security in Nepal and globally. She has led numerous advocacy programs linking UN frameworks provided by CEDAW, the Beijing Platform for Action, and UN Security Council Resolution 1325. She is the recipient of the Woman of Distinction Award in 2016, conferred by the NGO CSW Committee for her contribution to gender equality globally. She was a member of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Group for the Global Study on UN Security Resolution 1325 and a member of the UN Women Global Civil Society Advisory Group from 2012 to 2015. So Bandana Rana, thank you so much for being with us today. She has noted that she'll be joining with a bit of audio considerations that we need to be mindful of today. So we will hope to hear you clearly. I'm going to move through and introduce all of the participants at once now. So if we could have next slide, please. We are so pleased and honored to have also with us Ms. Jan Logie, who is the Undersecretary for Domestic and Sexual Violence of the New Zealand government. Jan Logie is a Green MP and Undersecretary to the Minister of Justice, responsible for domestic and sexual violence issues. She has campaigned for women's rights throughout her life, including as the coordinator of the Wellington Women's Refuge and executive director of YWCA Aotearoa, New Zealand, and volunteering with Wellington Rape Crisis Youth Line and Help Sexual Abuse Crisis Line. She championed the Domestic Violence Victims Protection Act, which provides paid leave and flexible working arrangements for people affected by domestic violence. She is the lead minister for a whole of government joint venture to eliminate family violence and sexual violence. She oversees the implementation of new family violence legislation and is working on justice system reforms to improve the experience of victims and survivors in sexual violence cases. We look forward to hearing from you. Next, we will have Ms. Kitanaka, who's the executive director of the All Japan Women's Shelter Network and board member of the ASEAN Network of Women's Shelters. Ms. Kitanaka is an associate professor at the Hiroshima University Harassment Consultation Office in Japan, president of the NGO Sexual Violence Victim Support Hiroshima, a rape crisis center for Hiroshima. She works as a social worker on university campus dealing with harassment, bullying, discrimination, and violence. Her major research themes are sociological gender theory, violence against women, harassment on campus, academic harassment, and academic misconduct. We so much look forward to hearing from you, Ms. Kitanaka. Finally, we're delighted to have with us from Geneva, very early on Wednesday, Dr. Avni Amin, who is with the WHO Department of Reproductive Health and Research on Violence Against Women. Her primary focus is to support countries, ministries of health in particular, in the translation and uptake of WHO's normative guidelines and tools to strengthen health systems' response to violence against women. She has led the development of clinical guidelines for responding to child and adolescent sexual abuse and is the lead author of the WHO Global Plan of Action on strengthening health systems' response to addressing interpersonal violence, in particular against women and girls and against children. Avni is a passionate feminist scientist with a fierce commitment to gender equality and women's health. She is originally from India and considers herself a global citizen. So as you can see, we have a remarkable passionate group of experts who will be guiding us through this session today. So I look forward to having each of you speak. Next slide, please. So as we move into this session and as we move into deeper discussions, we wanted to start with a very brief overview of some data on violence against women. We understand that violence is common in every country. We now have fairly reliable evidence in many of the countries, as you can see in front of you. This is a collection of countries that have implemented the WHO study on violence against women, that methodology on violence against women, or the domestic violence module, or the demographic and health study. So as you can see, there are significant rates of violence against women in most countries around this region. This is a snapshot of Asia Pacific, and I thank our colleagues at UNFPA for presenting this data to us in a way that we can easily see it. What you see in front of you is percentage of women who've experienced in the larger box. It's percentage, or sorry, in the larger circles. It's the percentage of women who disclosed experiencing physical or sexual violence or both by an intimate partner in their lifetime. So that's the larger circle. It might be brown or gray on your screen. And then the smaller circle within the larger circle that's orange is the percentage of women who disclosed experiencing physical or sexual violence or both by an intimate partner in the last 12 months prior to the survey. And so, you know, what we're hoping to see is that there's a change. And so we're hoping to see a gap in the lifetime experiences of violence, the larger circle, and the smaller circle, which is the last 12 months, most recent experiences of violence. And what we hope will be able to allow that change to happen is to have strong laws, policies, programming approaches, and attention to prevention. So that's precisely what we'll be talking about in our session today. So we'll be happy to share these slides following the session if you'd like more information. Next slide, please. Now, we are all here mindful of many of the restrictions that we've been experiencing personally, that our friends and families have been experiencing wherever they are around the world. And we're very conscious that COVID-19 has brought quite a few challenges, anxieties, fears to many of us. Unfortunately, as I just outlined, violence against women was already a massive problem with the enormous unmet need, let's say. And COVID has brought, let's say, additional stress, anxieties, and difficulties. We have seen in many countries a spike in the number of calls to hotlines and women who are reaching out for help related to domestic violence. And we see that as a signal that there's a serious problem that we need to be addressing as best as we can. Now, we also know that doesn't tell us the full story, right? Those numbers, the numbers of calls to hotlines is an important indication, but it certainly doesn't give us the whole story, because we know that many women never reach out for help. Many women never tell anyone about what's happening to them. And so we have to be mindful of how are we trying to reach those women? How are we creating services or outreach that can meet their needs? And so this is one of the points that we'll be talking about during today's session. So here, you know, in this session, we'll be walking through how we are trying to respond to as well as prevent violence before, during, and after COVID. And COVID is teaching us some very important lessons. So I'm going to move to the next slide, please. And I'm going to invite Ms. Bandana Rana to give us an overview of this issue based on your perspective and based on the last meeting of the Beijing+25 review. Over to you, Ms. Rana. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Warm greetings to everyone from Nepal. Nepal was awakened by a big jolt of earthquake this morning at 5:30 a.m. And our internet connections have been very wavering and disrupted. I'm using my iPhone, and hopefully we'll be able to stay with you throughout this session. First of all, I would like to thank ESCAP and UN Women and all the presenters yesterday who shared the knowledge and insight which was very, very informative. So my gratitude to all of you. 25 years ago, many of us in this virtual meeting today were in Beijing as part of the collective power that led to the adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action. I'm feeling euphoric and nostalgic because that is where the seed to my advocacy to gender equality was sown, and I'm sure it is the same for many of us. Beijing placed on the global stage the collective vision of women's movements worldwide, which was pivotal to advancing the most progressive outcomes adopted by the conference. Since the Beijing conference, much has been achieved in creating laws to protect women's rights in political representation, security from violence, laws on domestic violence, inheritance, reproductive health, and increasing presence of national gender machineries. Also, the civil society is getting even more vibrant, and there is increasing collaboration between different and new stakeholders. However, despite these achievements in the 25 years, we have also witnessed backlash against those gains and the consolidation of power imbalances and structures underlying women's oppression, particularly in regard to the persistent prevalence of violence against women, including new and emerging forms of violence. There are gaps in laws, implementation of legal protection, and lack of access to essential services for women. Gender norms and stereotypes is one of the key barriers, as also identified during the Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference on Beijing+25 review held last November at the ESCAP. The Asia-Pacific Declaration on Advancing Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, Beijing+25 review, identified as one of the priority areas freedom from violence, stigma, harmful stereotypes, and negative social norms. The country is committed to reviewing, among many other things, I'm just highlighting a few, reviewing, amending, enacting, and enforcing legislation in reference to CEDAW, CRC, and other relevant regional and international human rights obligations and treaties. Strengthening the capacity of legal systems and institutions to translate legislation into implementation that ensures women's and girls' access to justice. Providing high-quality protection and support services for victims, survivors, and witnesses. Strengthening data collection and evidence. Establishing, strengthening, and promoting comprehensive, coordinated, interdisciplinary, linguistically and culturally accessible and sustained multisectoral services, programs, and responses. Strengthening and allocating resources to national machineries for the promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women. Transforming negative gender norms, discriminatory social attitudes, and collaborating with all relevant stakeholders, including civil society, and engaging men and boys and women and girls. When the onset of COVID, right after the conference in December, with that, these commitments have become even more vital now. The COVID has turned the world upside down. The pandemic has had a disproportionate and devastating social and economic impact, as we heard from the presenters yesterday, on women and girls. Particularly, reports from around the world of skyrocketing levels of gender-based violence is alarming. Even the most developed countries have reported a 30 to 40% spike in violence against women, particularly domestic violence, and for many countries, this percentage is even much higher. It is a crisis within a crisis, and the Secretary General also termed it as a shadow pandemic. In many countries, domestic violence has tripled. Before the COVID, we said that one in every 3 women faced violence, and out of this violence, 40% of women face domestic violence. In some countries, this percentage is as high as 70%. So we can imagine these 40% to 70% during the lockdown were confined with an abuser 24/7, and moreover, their workload had burdened and increased 4 times, as was shared yesterday, catering to the demands of the family members and the perpetrator confined in it. And also because in many countries, in rural urban areas, rural and poor urban areas, a family is living in just one room. So the restriction of mobility did not even give them the opportunity to share the violence that they faced, which they usually did with a friend or a neighbor or just walking down the street, or go to the police station or support services. So this was totally restricted in very confined places as well. You know, I would just like to share some experiences because I'm a co-founder of an NGO called Sati and continue to provide strategic direction, particularly during the lockdown, because Sati operates 4 women's shelters and 5 children's shelters. And our first thought when the lockdown began was our staff, because, you know, like this, we need to see what kind of capacity we have, the infrastructure, the unpreparedness. So the staff in the shelters thought we should close our shelters and do not take new entries because of the fear of transmission, because testing was not available at that time. Transmission from a new entry to the residents who are already there. So the trauma that the staff were facing, however, we had a very intense session with the staff and convinced that we should open our shelter services. But with the infrastructures, most shelters in countries like Nepal have very poor infrastructure. Usually there's only 1 toilet. Thankfully, we had 2 toilets in Sati. So what we did was we decided we would open our shelters and continue our services. We assigned 1 room for the new entries and 1 separate toilet for the new entries. However, in the beginning, we did not get any new entries because in the beginning, none of the victims could access services, I suppose. But after a week or so, we got some entries, particularly from rape, sexual violence, and incest. And when we took in a new entry, the trauma that those already living in the shelters and the staff was so immense that the residents in the shelters actually called the police and said, Sati is killing us. They brought in a COVID affected person and we will all get transmitted. They even called the police. So we have to face with this, and also the stigma to the new entry was very, very immense. So the challenges were capacity, the unpreparedness, the poor infrastructure, the stigma, all these challenges that we had to face as shelter operators. So then we decided that perhaps we should open an emergency shelter, a new emergency temporary shelter in a head office, because as it is, it was closed. So we needed to purchase clothing and beddings for the new shelter. But we did not get a license from the chief district officer to go out and purchase these things because shelter services was not under essential services. So this was a huge setback to us. However, our partnership with the police, I think the police is extremely important here. Our partnership with the police, we told the police, because most of the cases that we get are referred by the police as well. So the police understood a dilemma, but they thought it would be a very long bureaucratic process to actually start getting a license. And by that time, we would be losing time. So the police assured us that they would give us security and they would notify other stations where we would be shopping. So we had to notify them every morning. So that's the partnership that worked with the police at that time. But what I am trying to share here is that, as I said, the unpreparedness and the essential needs of support services to access justice, access support, was extremely weak during this time. And only some shelters could open partially. I remember some shelters saying we cannot open at all because even our own shelters in the districts have only 1 toilet. So it was very extremely difficult to have alternative shelter support services at this time. In terms of quarantine spaces also, though the government did its best to organize a gender-friendly quarantine spaces, there were no counseling services, toilets were separate, but we also heard in the districts of a health volunteer actually sexually abusing a COVID positive person in the camp itself, in the quarantine camp itself. So these are some of the challenges that countries like ours face. Just to share with you. And the other impact, yesterday we've already heard that the socio-economic impact of COVID-19 is interconnected with the vulnerabilities that lead to increasing violence, including health and economic access to health services, deprioritizing of maternal mortality issues, as well as other health issues, standard hospitals being transformed into COVID hospitals, and other services being transferred to small health posts who did not have the capacity at all. In terms of economic, we've heard that the workload, unpaid care workload of women have increased 4 times. Women have had to look after the children, handle their own work, as well as the work of the education of their children. The ILO reported that by June, 70% of women domestic workers had lost their jobs. And in Nepal, there was a recent study where it said 41% during the lockdown 41% of women have lost income compared to 28% of men. So what needs to be done? In this context, it is even more vital that we accelerate the commitments made in November through a COVID lens. Perhaps this pandemic has also provided an opportunity to review what had been going wrong, what needs to be prioritized, and where investments need to be made. CEDAW has issued a guidance note calling on states to uphold the rights of women and girls and to protect women from and ensure accountability for gender-based violence, enables women's social and economic empowerment, and guarantee their participation in policy and decision-making in all crisis responses and recovery efforts. The CEDAW Convention, with its legislative and binding framework, is the strongest mechanism to hold member states accountable to their commitments, to put women and girls, their inclusion, representation, rights, social and economic outcomes and protection at the center of all efforts to tackle and recover from COVID-19. And before I end, just some immediate action points that's needed. National COVID response program with women at the center, gender analysis of the impact at every level, designate women's shelters as essential services and to continue and expand online services, increase funding for shelters and support services, expanding access to quality multi-sectoral responses for survivors covering safety, shelter, health, justice, and other essential services, step up investments in prevention, capacity development of entities providing services, including the police, expand social safety nets, and recognize the value of invisible and unpaid care work, prioritizing and funding primarily healthcare and universal health coverage, and strengthening data. And in closing, program lost may take years, even generations to recover. What is needed even more now is collective energy and collective work. With effective partnerships and intersectional lens and greater synergy between human rights mechanisms and civil society, we can collectively shape strategies to respond to the impact of COVID-19, to ensure the rights to life, dignity, and security for everyone with a fair and non-stereotyped mindset. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rana, for your remarks and for these important reminders, as well as new insights about how we can be applying the very valuable, very well-prepared existing commitments to ending violence against women under CEDAW and other international laws and norms. You've really brought us some very valuable new information about how we have to be emergency-minded. We have to take a different mindset these days. So thank you for these valuable interventions. I want to ask if we can go to the next, this next slide. We had it looks like there's some type of lines on the screen, sorry for that. But there are a quick summary of the declaration and report from the Beijing+25 meeting, which was held last November. And, you know, a lot of the points that Ms. Rana has just raised are captured in this report. And we can see that, you know, the negotiations and the discussions among member states last November, you know, were right on point, and they captured a lot of the critical elements that you've discussed related to making sure that there's policies in place and that there's funding and resources and there's a plan to be able to respond to emergencies. So we've got a few of those quick summaries here, as well as on the next slide, please. Thank you. And I think that your acknowledgement that you know, how we're treating each other in families and how we are approaching gender norms in families, how we're balancing decision-making, role sharing, and what that means to unpaid care, and how that might be linking to violence against women is very valuable. So we know that we need everyone in to be able to properly end violence against women and transform those negative gender norms. So next slide, please. So I'm very pleased to be able to request the intervention from Ms. Jan Logie, who's the Undersecretary for Domestic and Sexual Violence in New Zealand. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today, Ms. Logie. Thank you for being with us. As we were preparing for this session, we asked her to consider a few questions, and that's on the next slide, please. And so the questions that we asked her to keep in mind are, the following. And we sort of, we requested the presence of Ms. Logie because we understand that the New Zealand government has prioritized violence against women's services this year and has boosted funding this year with linked with COVID. Sorry, I've got something coming up on my screen. We wanted to understand better what informed these decisions to prioritize violence against women in New Zealand. And we also appreciate that COVID-19 has revealed close associations between women's economic status, safety, and the experiences of violence. What potential is there to address women's economic empowerment and status associated with ending violence against women through policies, program, workplace approaches, or other interventions? So over to you, Ms. Logie. Thank you so much.
Kia ora koutou, and I just want to acknowledge everybody and for the opportunity. I feel incredibly privileged to be part of this conversation. So it's a very limited time. I'll try and get stuck into the questions because there's so much to say. One of the first points I'd like to make though is that I guess that government had made addressing gender-based violence a priority when they came into, when the government was formed in 2017, and that happened with the creation of my position, which is the first time that we've had somebody in government responsible for overseeing this work and attempting to drive it. And also that we had created a joint venture, moving away from individual government agencies being responsible for their bit, so that now 10 agencies and their chief executives are collectively responsible for this work to end family and sexual violence. And that also gives us the ability to partner with Māori as the Indigenous people in making sure that we have appropriate responses and to work together with the community. And that meant that when COVID hit, there was a pathway in for communication from the community into government and vice versa. And that has put us, I think, in a better position than we would have been in otherwise through the pandemic. In terms of our experience in terms of levels of violence, of family violence and sexual violence since the pandemic, we saw an initial spike, and this is only going by police reporting, court data and phone line to NGOs, but that's actually flattened off to levels comparable before we went into lockdown as a country. And but they are higher levels than they were last year because we've been working to try and increase reporting across the country. But what we're hearing from the community is a concern around increased levels of violence and more, at least it's anecdotal evidence at this stage, around increased dating violence and sexual violence. So we know this isn't going to be a short-term intervention, that in fact dealing with COVID and the ongoing effects of it will be long-term work for us. Having had that joined up response, it gave us a centre of expertise within government that meant that we were able to scan the international evidence and experience from others, as well as our own experience after the Canterbury earthquake, to look at what were the key things that we needed to be aware of. And they came down to 5 key points that I'll try and go through in this presentation. So the first one was clear communications of the services available, so that we we have a website available that is promoted widely by government in response to COVID-related information. In that website is a specific page around family violence and sexual violence and all of the help agencies available. And this included the development and funding of a specialist helpline for people with learning disabilities, so it was a new accessibility initiative, as well as making national a helpline for people who use violence if they were concerned about an escalation, that they could reach out for help. There also was a centre of information through what we call a family violence clearinghouse, and it's set within a university to disseminate information to our frontline providers, and they had a Māori and a non-Māori section to that website, and it was a key point of information. And our Ministry of Justice had information around shared parenting advice, but I'll come back to that later because that's an area for where we need to get better. And the second thing was around communication between government and our frontline workers. And we were incredibly lucky, and I just want to sing the praises of our NGO sector, who set up a pandemic working group, and it ended up being up to, at times, 60 frontline workers from across the country who met with representatives of all of those government agencies, and they were able to disseminate the information about what the response was happening from government, and also give us feedback on what was working or not working, as the case was. And I think this partnership led to and was in part of how we managed to get the money to the frontline services and ensure that they got the protective gear, possibly not as quickly as we would have if we'd had a pre-existing pandemic plan, and also to ensure that everyone were able to know that whether they were an essential service or not, and make sure, and which they were. They clearly were designated as essential services. And that was a critical part of all of our work, and we still have those relationships ongoing. The third thing was a message from government that family and sexual violence was still being taken seriously. It's a fundamental, that there were no excuses were going to be made because there was a pandemic, that actually we were taking this COVID really seriously as a country because of public safety, and this is a core safety issue. So that was making sure that that information was on that COVID website, that there was took a little while to develop, but a television advert making sure that people knew that, and also being very clear that the police leadership would communicate that through to frontline officers to make sure that when they were being called out, that they weren't making those excuses. Of course, as always, we heard mixed feedback about how well that message got through. And also making sure that we had emergency accommodation for people using violence if they were being removed from their house, that there was somewhere safe that they could go. The fourth thing was increased financial support for victims, so that we put 22 million into our victim services, and that this enabled them. So the example of our safe houses became closed bubbles. No new people could come into them, but what happened was that our agencies were resourced to be able to put people into motels and keep working with them, but into their own new safe bubbles. So that, and that we also made sure they had the resources to be able to get people phones and data to be able to maintain safe communication and food, and worked with the Ministry of Education to get school resources for our kids and make sure they were able to do online learning when that was happening. And that was really important. And it was also part of our specialist services, but also wider services, and where there were existing relationships that people were encouraged to reach out and check in with people to see how they were doing, to be identifying if there was a problem, rather than just waiting for people to call the police. And making sure that the courts kept going in terms of access to protection orders and people being able to do affidavits remotely, rather than, so that we just removed some of those unnecessary barriers in terms of contact. And then the fifth point was around information and protocol and tools for the frontline workers. And there's a couple of points I want to make on that. So one, it took us a while to get the PPP to protective gear to everyone to enable them to do the job, but we did eventually. And the other key really great thing was actually supporting frontline practitioners shift to working more online. And we saw some really positive engagements from some providers, particularly working with young people, that they found some of them engaged more online than they were in a face-to-face setting. But that we had regular meetings supported by the Ministry of Justice with practitioners, being able to debrief and support each other in that change of practice so that we could ensure good practice. So to the second question around economic empowerment, I think I just want to speak specifically to 3 interventions that we're looking at that are specific responses to violence against women that have positive economic impacts. But these are deeply entwined issues. But to speak to the 3, so one is the introduction of the Domestic Violence Victims Protection Act, which provides flexible working arrangements. So you can get your contact details taken out of the public sphere. You can get a new phone number in your workplace. You could work from a different site or change your hours of work so that if you have an abusive partner or being stalked, that you're less able to be targeted in the workplace. And it provides the framework for their employers to know how to keep their staff safe, and also provides up to 10 days leave, paid leave from work up every year for people who are affected by domestic violence or caring for children who have been, so they can get to court, so that they can find a new house, or also just be there for their kids if they really need them there. And if their partner's preventing them from getting to work, that they've got a valid reason for not attending, so that they keep their attachment to jobs, which we know is a pathway to safety for many women, and maintains those positive social relationships to help them get to safety. And we're hearing really great feedback, though we don't have data on the impact of that yet, is that we saw through COVID as well the importance of removing barriers to accessing social security, because as people were either unemployed already or becoming unemployed, that support and removing the barriers to getting that financial support was essential for them being able to see a pathway to getting out and being able to support themselves and their children. And also sexual harassment interventions, and we're doing a consultation out at the moment on that, because we know that intervention can actually create opportunities for women to stay in jobs and progress in jobs that they're prevented from at the moment, but also has impacts in terms of home life and safety more broadly in society. And we've got fairly traditional mix of interventions in relation to sexual harassment at the moment that aren't working as well as we would like, and we're very conscious that we've got a lot of work to do in that area, and huge benefit if we can improve that. Also recognising that while the government may not talk about it, that also the agenda for economic empowerment for women, which we have been progressing around furthering pay equity settlements, of valuing traditional women's work of caring, which has, a pro-social value to it, as well as economically empowering women directly to be able to have more choices in terms of protecting themselves and living free from violence, is part of the priority of this government, as has been making changes to our wider social security system that has meant that too many women have articulated a feeling that they need to choose between being safe versus being in poverty, and that's not a choice that we want women to have to make. There are some of the quick overview of some of the things that we're doing. I don't want to, and having come from the NGO sector and spent a lot of my life complaining about government, I don't want to give the impression that we think we've got it all right. And there is a lot that COVID has shown up of existing problems within the system, and I'm really happy to talk more to some of our work in that area next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary Logie, for your interventions and for sharing what you've seen as priority, what you've seen as essential, and some of the ways that the government has partnered together with civil society to solve these really serious challenges in a very new context, right? That we're all sort of learning within. So we've taken some notes about these interventions, and I think there's questions already in the chat for you based on some of those. So we'll come back to some of those questions in a moment when it's time for the discussion. Thank you very much for sharing what you've shared. Could we have the next slide, please? Great. So I would like to offer the floor to our next speaker, Ms. Kitanaka, Executive Director of the All Japan Women's Shelter Network and board member of the Asian Network of Women's Shelters. So in preparation for this segment, next slide, please. We asked her a couple of questions. We noted that the Asian Network of Women's Shelters is a regional body that connects women's shelters across countries in this region and globally. During the height of COVID unfolding in this region, the Asian Network of Women's Shelters hosted a series of global calls to allow shelters to share challenges and solutions quickly. Some of the same things that Ms. Logie was referring to, getting people to motels or other solutions quickly. So we wanted to ask you, Ms. Kitanaka, what were the key challenges that stood out during this time, and what solutions did the shelters and crisis services, other frontline services, develop to respond to violence against women in the face of COVID? And then we also wanted to hear a bit from you, a bit more about this technology-based service and how that's functioning. We know there's been a lot of lessons learned, and you might have insights to provide. So the floor is yours, Ms. Kitanaka. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. Hello from Japan. Please move to the next slide. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Yes. The Asian Network of Women's Shelters hosted a series of webinars with our global network during the COVID-19 crisis. In this presentation, I will share the key lessons we learned from this period. First, let me introduce you to ANWS. The Asian Network of Women's Shelters was launched as the first Asian Conference of Women's Shelters in Taipei in 2012. At that meeting, we agreed to work on 4 objectives: to be a platform to promote learning between countries, to build the capacity of the Asian shelters, to advocate for better policies and legislation, and to protect victims of gender-based violence, and to be a voice for Asian women. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. After COVID-19 started to spread, we quickly organized a webinar for our members and co-hosted the event with the Global Network of Women's Shelters. In all, we have held 13 webinars so far. At first, we held once a week, but as the crisis subsided, we held them once every 2 weeks, and now once a month. A total of 1,728 people from 70 countries have joined the webinars. As the situation changed, we focused on different topics from safety measures in shelters, protection of domestic violence victims in lockdown, using technology to support victims remotely, strategies for fundraising, how to adjust when lockdown is lifted, and stopping human trafficking and exploitation. Next, please. And these were the 5 main lessons we learned. 1. National and global networks are vital. 2. Violence against women is an ongoing pandemic. 3. We can use technology to help victims of violence. 4. Women's shelters are essential services. And 5. DV hotlines in every country of the world. Next, please. On the first lesson, we found that countries where women's shelter networks were strong, like the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, could mobilize quickly to lobby the government and public for support and raise awareness about the issue of domestic violence in lockdown situations. While donations for NGOs dropped in many other countries, these countries saw an increase in donations. As well as national networks, the global network was very important to help build solidarity, share knowledge, and encourage each other. Through our weekly webinars, we connected with each other, heard each other's story, and gave each other mutual support. In a real way, the global network helped sustain shelters in isolated situations. Next, please. Second, although we knew this already, the COVID crisis has highlighted the fact that violence against women is an ongoing pandemic. COVID brought out the best, but also the worst in humanity. It broke open the fault lines in society, including the issue of racism and police brutality, which was highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement and also the tragedy of domestic violence. In most countries that went into lockdown, domestic violence rose by 20 to 40%. In Latin America, where femicide is a pandemic, we heard reports that the bodies of murdered women were thrown out on the street using the excuse that they had died of COVID. The exception was New Zealand, where domestic violence actually dropped. Next, please. Third, we learned in our webinars how we can use technology to help survivors of violence. The Safety Net project in the USA and applied in Australia by WESNet is an example of how shelter organizations can use technology. The project helps protect women from being tracked by their abusers and guides social workers to use the best technology to reach survivors. Whether it is WhatsApp, Facebook, or Zoom, or more low-tech solutions like text messages or phone calls. Next, please. Fourth, COVID confirmed what we already knew, that shelters are essential services. Our members all said no matter how bad the pandemic was, they would keep their shelters open. We helped them by sharing good protection practices, contingency plans, and staff organizations. As well as providing essential services, shelters were able to give our government first-hand information on the status of domestic violence during the crisis. This information was vital to help government make the right policy decisions to protect women locked down at home. Next, please. Finally, we learned the importance of having women's crisis hotlines in every country. GNWS is working together with ANWS and other regional and national alliances to make a list of trustworthy crisis hotlines. So no matter where you are in the world, there is always a number to call if you need help. Next, please. Yes, these were our lessons. COVID addressed the fault lines of economic injustice, situational racism, institutional racism, gender-based violence, but we turned the crisis around good practices, investment in essential services, and strong solidarity. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kitanaka, for sharing with us your experiences and insights related to how shelters in Japan, but around the region and even around the world, have been responding to violence against women right during COVID and finding new solutions to be able to do so. I think you've underlined the critical importance of keeping keeping shelters and other frontline services for survivors of violence as essential. So thank you for that message and for picking up on some of the broader issues related to discrimination and structural racism. These are all important elements that really feed into these dynamics that we're trying to address. So thank you for your intervention, and we will come back to you with some remarks and questions shortly. Thank you. I'd like to now turn our attention to Dr. Avni Amin from the World Health Organization. As we were preparing for this session, we prepared a slide with some questions for Avni. So next slide, please. What we wanted to consider with you, Avni, was the fact that COVID has highlighted that violence against women is prevalent and that crises like this put additional pressure on families, as we've been hearing. In addition to reviewing response services to meet the, in addition to providing response services, this text box is in the way of the slide and I can't read the question. To be sure that they meet the needs of survivors during crises, what should be done to prevent violence from happening in the first place? So we've all had our minds on response services. How do we meet the incredible need that's out there that we know that we're not meeting? What can be done to maintain a focus on prevention, even during crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic? So Avni, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, and hello from Geneva. I'm going to actually answer this question in two parts. In the first part, I'm going to just maybe reflect a little bit on what we know about the burgeoning evidence on what works to prevent violence against women, and present a framework, an interagency framework called RESPECT, which speaks to 7 strategies that we know work to prevent violence against women. And the second part of my presentation will speak to how these can be adapted or what becomes particularly relevant in the context of the COVID pandemic. Just to say that this framework RESPECT has wide UN ownership because it was developed jointly by WHO and UN Women together with 5 other UN agencies, including UNFPA, UNDP, UNODC, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and 6 governments, including the government of Australia, Canada, UK, USA, and Netherlands and Sweden, who have all endorsed this framework. What we are now doing is translating this framework into an implementation handbook which is being led by UN Women with WHO. and together with Melissa and others, working to roll this out to support governments as well as practitioners of programming for prevention to really put in place evidence-based programming for prevention. And obviously, given the COVID context, we are rapidly adapting to making sure that this is going to be available in an online learning modality. Next slide, please. Just to flag that we are trying to make this widely accessible through different UN languages and trying to also make it accessible for policymakers with limited time and bandwidth in different formats. I think given COVID, what we've realized is that intimate partner violence continues to be one of the most common forms of violence that is experienced by women. And of course, along with sexual violence. And so a lot of the evidence that we have on prevention programming has actually really focused on intimate partner violence. And obviously it points to the need for building evidence in other areas of violence against women, but largely this is where we are today in the field for evidence-informed programming for prevention. Next slide, please. I just wanted to flag that what we know in terms of data, it's 30% of physical and or sexual violence. And as we saw from the no violence data, it varies considerably across countries. And in many countries, the figure is much, much higher than 30%. Next slide, please. Next slide. In terms of prevention programming, one of the things that we've learned through practice and through interventions is it's not just what you do to implement prevention, but how it is implemented, which becomes very critical for effective programming. And so one of the first steps that we recommend for all policymakers to do as part of prevention programming is to really assess the risk and protective factors in their own contexts. And then to really focus on the 7 strategies that we know have an evidence base for prevention. And these 7 strategies are organized as relationship skills strengthened, empowerment of women, services, reduction of poverty, making sure that environments are safe, and then really thinking about child and adolescent abuse prevention and transforming norms. Under each of them, there are many, many interventions that have been trialed and tested, and some of them work better than others. And that's to say that what we really are leaning towards is focusing on those that are promising, but also keeping in mind the need to be innovative in this field, to also continue to innovate on things that we don't know yet are effective, so that the field can grow and the evidence base can grow with more and more options for governments to implement evidence-informed programming. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. One of the critical steps in good, effective prevention programming that we have learned through RESPECT is the importance of having a theory of change, where we have a clear goal in mind to what impact we want to achieve and how we are going to get there. And in order to do that, we also need to assess the evidence that we have on interventions. One of the things that we need to focus on is what are the intermediate pathways to change, so that eventually the goal at the national level or on a large scale level is reductions in intimate partner violence or sexual violence. But in order to get there, one of the big intermediate outcomes that we know, which is a risk factor, is to change harmful gender norms that condone violence against women. And that has been one of the areas where there's been a lot of innovation in programming for prevention. Next slide, please. So this slide, I don't really expect people to read the fine print, but it's just to say that we are actually better off with prevention programming than we were 10 years ago. And we have, from both low and high income countries, evidence of promising interventions in each of the 7 strategies. So under relationship skill strengthening, we have a fairly robust base of evidence that group-based workshops with both men and women to really focus and promote egalitarian values and attitudes and relationships, including through couples counseling, are promising. Under empowerment of women, we are getting a lot of evidence now that combined empowerment strategies that include an economic component, but also gender training is quite promising in low middle income country setting. Under services, we have a whole repository of options ranging from health to justice to social to shelters, and some that are more promising than others. Under poverty reduction, we know that economic cash transfers, particularly unconditional cash transfers, are quite promising. Employment support for women is also another area. And then under environment safe, we are getting a lot of evidence now on whole school-wide interventions, as well as on safe cities and bystander interventions. And for child and adolescent abuse prevention, we have evidence around parenting support interventions, as well as home visitation by health workers to parents, to new parents and young parents. And then lastly, as I said, one of the areas where there's been a lot of innovation in the prevention field has been around transforming gender norms and attitudes. Now here I'm going to just specifically point out what are the implications under a COVID context and where we really need to prioritize. I think that we have specifically spoken, the previous speakers have spoken about the need to include services for survivors as essential part of services that are continued during and after COVID. And definitely in many of the packages that are being recommended, including by WHO for essential reproductive health and health services, violence against women is included as part of the essential health services package. The other area where I think we have an opportunity to really build in prevention in a more mindful way, even under the COVID context, is really in the space of poverty reduction. We already have heard from the previous speakers about the devastating economic impacts, and particularly on women who largely tend to work in informal sectors. And here, social and financial protection measures like cash transfers, like government interventions to support women who are losing their jobs, are going to make a big impact on the intermediate outcomes that lead to reductions in violence. The other area where I think will be significantly important, but where we have a bit of a challenge, is in transforming gender norms and attitudes. And one of the reasons is because the big evidence base for this comes from community mobilization. And in the lockdown conditions, community mobilization for a lot of NGOs who are programming in this area has been challenging. So one of the innovations that I think people are doing are around really focusing on how to convert some of these interventions through online modalities. Next slide, please. Next slide. One of the things I think we've learned from prevention programming is the importance of an enabling environment. And here's where we really need government commitments to violence against women. And I really was very pleased to hear the previous intervention from New Zealand about an explicit commitment to including family violence. And this is the kind of government commitment that we need under COVID to really ensure that there is political will to continue funding and allocating resources and investing in the work that women's rights organizations are doing at the front line. And then really making sure that there is continued enforcement of laws and policies that promote gender equality. Next slide. One of the big learnings for prevention has been that interventions that are implemented for prevention have guiding principles that will make it more likely that these interventions are going to work. And what the field has learned is specifically ensuring that there is an explicit attention to gender equality and gender power, to intersectionality, to making sure that there is a clear theory of change, to making sure that there is efforts to really implement participatory approaches that foster critical reflections about power, to make sure that the interventions are intersectoral and coordinated across sectors, and that we don't divide prevention into primary prevention versus secondary, but to see it as a continuum and through the life course, which is where some of the work on intersections of violence against women and violence against children becomes an important focus of a more comprehensive approach to preventing violence against both women and children. Next slide. The other thing we are learning from the field is about scaling up and taking what are often put in place as boutique or pilot interventions to scale. And one of the things we're learning is that scaling up really needs to be mindful of investing in capacity amongst implementers. Something that works in 5 communities, to take it to scale to 20,000 communities cannot be done without investing in capacity amongst the implementers, to making sure that there's synergies with ongoing initiatives, and that there is an constant attention to monitoring and evaluation as the scaling is done. To take something from 5 services, 5 one-stop crisis centers to 45 without evaluating constantly whether it's working would be a lot of waste of resources. So that's one thing that we need to continuously emphasize, is the ongoing monitoring and evaluation of prevention programming. Next, the last slide. Just to flag that there are a lot of materials to support the implementation of respect, including videos and postcards and things like that. But perhaps one of the things that we need to see COVID as devastating as it has been, that it is an opportunity, because the fault lines of gender equality have been so exposed. We have the opportunity, through a renewed emphasis on unpaid care work, through a renewed emphasis on addressing the economic crisis, to actually make sure that these interventions that are evidence-based are built into the prevention efforts and into economic recovery plans that governments are making. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Avni, for sharing what you've brought to this session today on prevention. I think that for those of us who've been working on violence against women for so many years, we really want to know what, is this something that we can really reduce in shorter time frames than what we used to think, which was generations from now that we might never see. And that story has really changed. And this respect framework really brings that forward. It brings a sense of possibility. And it brings forward the fact that we know that violence is preventable. And there are approaches that have been proven, effective in doing so. And so this is so valuable to bring that to our attention, to bring forward the tools, the evidence that I know policymakers are often looking for, as well as, practitioners, to be able to spend less time doing things that we are not certain might work, and spend more time focusing on the interventions that we know to have evidence behind them and have a good chance of working. So I really appreciate sharing this new framework that can guide us all and bring us more into focus in terms of the prevention approaches that we're selecting. COVID has taught us a lot of lessons, and one of, I think, those lessons is that we have to continue to improve in our prevention efforts. We can't let go of it. We can't only focus on the response side. So we have to take the long view. So this is so valuable to bring this into this session today. Thank you very much, Avni. So we wanted to ask, so we've now heard from all of the panelists. Thank you so much for all of these interventions. We have a question that is, what is your single, recommendation for decision makers and policies on ending violence against women linked to COVID-19 for future epidemics and emergencies. And that's a question that we put forward to all of the panelists. And so I wanted to quickly go through the panelists and ask you if you could give me, 30 seconds on what do you think would be your top recommendation. And we'll start from the top with Ms. Bandanarana. So very brief, please.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to all the panelists. So much of knowledge sharing, insights, and ways to go ahead. Okay, quickly, I think member states or countries need to revisit their earlier policies and see where did they go wrong, so that in a future pandemics and crisis as such, we know where investments need to be made, where capacity needs to be strengthened, so that the catastrophe brought about by such a crisis can be addressed collectively. Partnership, I think, is also extremely important. So that's my 30 seconds. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And now if I can turn to Undersecretary Logie, please.
Great, thanks. I think there's two things. So one, resourcing the frontline services on the ground, and partnership between all of the players. That for us, that pandemic working group, which answering other questions, was a fairly informal network, but the hope is, though we're in an election phase at the moment, so I can't guarantee anything, but that will continue, because it's communication between community and government, I think, is critical to success. And the other bit is around strengthening the intersectionality of who is at that table, from just those with a gender-based speciality to ensuring that disability and trans and rainbow and migrant and older and youth have to be at that table, because we don't have pathways for them to disclose or actually get the support that they need at the moment. And we have to be intersectional if we're going to be successful.
Fantastic, thank you. And you've just touched on a lot of comments that have come through into the chat, I think, all quickly, all at once. So fully agree, and I think we'll revisit that in a moment when we have a few responses to some of the remarks that have been made. So thank you, Undersecretary. Next, I'd like to turn to Ms. Kitanaka for your 30-second recommendation, please.
Okay, I'd like to say budget. The government put the budget on this issue. In many Asian countries, NGO shelters are lacking financial support by the government. Yes, all I needed to say is the budget. Thank you.
Okay, that is clear, and that is brief, and that is to the point. Thank you. Okay, and a really strategic and important one. Thank you. Okay, so finally to Avni. What is your single recommendation, Avni?
To program with very particular attention to what works, the evidence base, and to constantly monitor and evaluate not just the harmful and unintended impacts of programming, but obviously also any beneficial impacts. So to really make sure that scarce resources in this field are spent well on what we know works.
Brilliant, thank you. And you've touched on the resourcing. Many of you have touched on the resourcing. This underpins everything that we do, doesn't it? So highlighting that the resources are indeed scarce, and we need to be as smart as we possibly can be and evidence informed about how we take our approaches forward and what we prioritize. So I've got an eye on the clock. We have around 11 minutes by the clock in this room before we have to close our session. And so we have just a few minutes to take a few questions that came from the participants through the chat. And so I thought I'm just going to have a moment to give you some very quick questions and apologies to the participants. I think we acknowledged this from the beginning. We knew we wouldn't be able to respond to each individual comment or question, but we will capture them as we do the synthesis of the report. And we want you to know that we've noted all of your comments and questions, definitely. And so perhaps first to Bandanarana, a couple questions. I'll try to combine these. First, a question around justice. And there's been a few remarks and questions around justice. So if you could please offer your insights about keeping attention on the justice system and survivors of violence access to justice, even during this moment, this pandemic, and with attention to family law, as well as other types of law. And as well as how can we make sure that older women or women with disabilities are also able to access justice? So a very short response, please, Ms. Rana. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. First of all, I think, when you talk about access to justice, you do need transforming gender norms within the justice system is extremely important. And also to address family violence, particularly seen during the lockdown when all courts were closed, and that's when essential justice was required. So we do need to promote online court services as well as virtual court services during such emergencies. That's the other thing. In terms of accessibility, even CEDAW promotes the accessibility of elderly, disability, to make all support services, including shelters, very disabled friendly. In Nepal, there is one shelter solely for people living with disability. And I think the idea is not to have separate shelters, but to integrate in the existing shelters and to provide it infrastructures, capacity, resources to make it accessible and friendly for all people living with disability, as well as all ages of women and girls. I think that is extremely important. And I think there was a question on essential services. Yes, all the presenters have raised that the governments should consider shelters and support services, catering to family violence as essential services, post-COVID, pre-COVID, and during COVID, or during such emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that reflection and response. And now I'm going to turn quickly to Undersecretary Logi. You created a lot of interest, I think, with your remarks, and we received more than one comment about your reference to the civil society government coordination mechanisms. And so there was a question about whether that was a formalized structure, that conversation that you talked about between community and government, and if so, would this continue post-COVID? So over to you. Thank you.
I guess I've partially answered that. So it was initiated by NGOs. The membership was expanded over time. There was no limit. Government didn't decide who was there representing the community, which I think is critical, and is now developed into 2 work streams. So one for Indigenous peoples and the other for non-Indigenous peoples working in the front line, because we gender-based violence in this country was introduced and reinforced through colonisation, and we have a lot of work to do in terms of unpacking that and developing effective responses. And the meetings were formalised in that they were online. It was through the joint venture. Members of government agencies came regularly to that. They were at set times, but it's not formalized in any stronger sense than that. But my very dear hope that is that this will continue, because I think actually what we know about effective interventions and planning from government is that we need all of our heads in terms of getting good information to be able to monitor, and to be that it needs all of us, and that often the expertise and the drive for this work to happen comes from community, and government responds. So I think it's essential from my view to be creating more space for that. I hope that answered it.
Very good. Yes, thank you. Thank you for that additional response. Okay, so we have 5 minutes. And so just quickly for Ms. Kitanaka, there was a few questions around resourcing. We know that resources are an issue, remain an issue, and became maybe a bigger issue during COVID. So do you have any reflections about, you mentioned that in contexts or countries where there's already a network of shelters or service providers that are active, they were able to mobilize new fundraising more quickly. So do you want to offer a little bit of reflection about what may have worked well there?
So in Japanese context, we don't have any donation culture, so we are struggling to fundraising. But in some Asian countries, NGOs have a great work in advertising their work and to raise a fundraising. So we can learn each other. And we focused on how to raise money, and we discuss and share the information with each other. And I want to say about technology issue. And so SNS and online meeting is great, but in the end, to save the victim, we have to meet face to face eventually. So the technology is only the first step of the services. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kitanaka. Absolutely. I think that this is an experience that is seen and shared by so many contexts here around this call today. So I appreciate your additional insights, and we appreciate hearing from you based on your regional analysis, what helps in having visibility among these networks and these organizations and service providers, having them well known, having the understood in the community, and having hopefully a supportive base in these contexts can help when crises unfold. So thank you for that. So I'm gonna have one question for Avni. So there was a question about gender budget analysis on how much investments governments make for prevention and redress. So have you seen this type of analysis done? Do you want to speak to the costs of violence versus the cost to prevent violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two separate things around the costs of violence to GDP, and as you well know, there's a lot of data emerging about the GDP costs to violence. But I think a lot of policymakers are also demanding that if I have to prioritize X, Y, and Z prevention interventions, what are the implications in terms of how costly is it? And how do I then obviously make sure that there's budgeting for this? And we have gotten quite sophisticated in doing cost analysis or cost-effective analysis. There is within one of the initiatives that the UK government funded for HIV, which had a big component on GBV. I think what was very interesting is the way they thought of cost effectiveness. And this is important for the SDGs context, which is to not think of cost effectiveness only in terms of single purpose outcomes, but to think of it as multiple outcomes, such as, for example, a cash transfer intervention that was implemented in Malawi, having an impact on reducing teenage pregnancies, improving school outcomes, as well as reducing HIV. And what that allows in an SDG era is to actually think through how the cost of something can be distributed across the different ministries and different sectors for it to actually have multiple benefits and multiple outcomes across the different SDGs. And I think this is a very innovative way of thinking and presenting to policymakers about what an intervention will cost, especially in the violence against women field, because a lot of interventions are what we call structural interventions operating at a higher level. They're not like giving a pill for HIV. It's changing norms which will have benefits for many, many, many outcomes, learning outcomes, health outcomes, economic outcomes. And so that's how I think we need to start thinking about cost, and really then advocating with ministries of finance in terms of how to support prevention programming in a cost-effective way.
Wonderful, Avni. You've done it. You've really outlined how critical it is to connect the work, violence against women and the prevention of violence doesn't sit in one silo at all. It really covers so many sectors, so many disciplines, and we can drive change from so many angles and layers. And thank you for acknowledging, you and the other speakers, the connections with poverty, the connections with women's, roles and lives in the workforce. These are all such critical components that inform women's ability to leave a relationship that's abusive. So fantastic. Thank you for bringing those insights and the power of prevention. So we're really at time now. So I want to thank all of the speakers for your brilliant interventions and for bringing latest thinking, latest evidence to this group. We really appreciate all of your insights. So I'm just going to say a few words to close, reflecting on the fact that when we met in Bangkok in November 2019 for the Beijing+25 review, we had no idea what was coming. We didn't know what we would be learning this year in the context of COVID, and COVID has been teaching us, I think. It's taught us a lot about the gaps. Areas, the unfinished business that we still need to address. And it's accelerated our learning a good bit, including on violence against women. And I think that, COVID has really perhaps insisted that we need to look again at our development era programming to understand how flexible is it in the context of emergencies, of pandemics, of crises like this. And it's asking us to think differently about how we plan for emergencies, how we plan for unexpected shocks, and the reality that we need to be building this into our planning and systems a bit better. In the conversation today, and in the commentary from the participants in the chat, and the commentary from those of you who've spoken, you've really underlined the essential nature of violence against women's services, and to keep those right up front during COVID response plans. And thank you for underlining that. And I think that message came out very loud and clear. You also spoke about the importance of resourcing those services and keeping that within a government view that needs to be on the radar of government decision makers and finance and others. And I really appreciate that Bandana Rama, you were able to remind us that CEDAW really provides us with direction and the means to hold governments accountable, for governments to hold themselves accountable, for civil society to be part of that conversation. So thank you for that important reminder. You've also given some really important examples of partnerships and how partnerships between civil society and government can drive change in ways that perhaps were unanticipated. We appreciated and heard from many participants that we need to be focused on intersectionality, reaching those who are hard to reach, putting those people at the center of our designs, our interventions, whatever that might be, response or prevention, for example. And I think to close with prevention is really valuable. So thank you, Avni, for bringing that. We know that we need to be linking poverty reduction and violence against women differently, social protection, workplace policies, and violence against women. So, we're looking for new ways to weave all of these elements together, to do so with evidence in mind, to be able to measure our progress and be able to show those results as we move forward and to share them with each other. So I want to offer my thanks to all of you for your wonderful insights and for being part of this discussion today. And thank you to our partners at ESCAP for allowing this meeting to happen. So a warm thanks to all of you for what you've brought today. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to participants and also to the speakers for very lively discussions and commentaries in the chat box. Please do keep the sharing of good practices, promising practices, and various resources and reports coming as well. We will, of course, take note of these in the meeting report, as mentioned earlier. Now, closing session 3, moving on to session 4 on women and environmental sustainability. It's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of this session, our colleague from UN Women, Ms. Inka Kadir Sanova. She is the Regional Advisor on Gender and Climate Change here at the UN Women Regional Office in Bangkok, where she is leading the work for UN Women on gender mainstreaming in climate change and disaster risk reduction. She has more than 15 years of work experience in the area of environmental protection and climate change mitigation, and and adaptation, and has worked at different UN agencies, including the UN Climate Change Secretariat in Bonn. We are very privileged to have you with us today. Inka, please go ahead and start session 4. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning to all the participants. Good morning, my colleagues from ESCAP and UN Women. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. I think this meeting is really very timely, and the discussion was so interesting and insightful. I really enjoyed following the discussions yesterday and today in the morning. So it is now my pleasure to open the second session of the day, which will discuss the linkages between gender equality, environmental sustainability, and climate change in the context of COVID-19. It has been mentioned many times today and yesterday that the global pandemic has affected women and men differently. And the impact of the pandemic exacerbated the already pre-existing inequalities for girls and women, which are often hit the hardest by the climate related risks, but also by many other socioeconomic factors. But it is also important to recognize that women play an outsized role in responding to crisis and safeguarding the communities and protecting the environment. So in this session, we will discuss the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on women and how those impacts have been exacerbated in the new context, in the COVID-19 reality, while we also will recognize that the climate change continues to pose the global risks on sustainable development gains. And it is important to develop the COVID response measures, having in mind the persistent climate-related risks and the increasing natural disasters, which savage the Asia and the Pacific region. That is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to the adverse impacts of climate change. And of course, in this context, it's important to remind that women are more vulnerable than men to the effects of climate change, and not due to the fact that this physical phenomena affects different human beings in different ways, but it is due to the socioeconomic factors that impede women's progress, their participation, that limits their voice, that put some restrictive social norms and measures and beliefs on them that makes them less capable to adapt and withstand the impact of climate change. So on the next slide, I will, without further ado, I'll just introduce the topic. I just would like to recall that hold the previous slide, please. I would like to recall that the Beijing+25 declarations called for action in a number of areas of global concern, and one of these areas is environmental conservation, climate action, and resilience building. So on the next slide, more specifically, we will see the recommendations which came from our region, from Asia and the Pacific, and that were captured in the ministerial declaration that has been adopted last November here in Bangkok. So at that meeting, the member states and the civil society organizations have agreed that it is important to recognize the active role of women as holders of knowledge and agents of change. And it is time in the climate and environment space to move away from perceiving women as victims and as vulnerable groups of society, and recognize that they do have unique knowledge and they are able to drive the change and bring the benefit for the entire society. It was also called that for the integration of gender perspective in environment and climate change policies and implementation. Most of the sectors and subsectors that are included in this landscape of policies called environment and climate change are generally gender blind. These are the sectors that are dominated by men and that have traditionally had limited number of women in the employment in the sector and then in the leadership and decision-making positions. The next call was to encourage women's participation and recognize their leadership role, and also to put in place the strategies and mechanisms that will allow them to participate in this policy space, but also to to be recognized as the agents of change, as I already have mentioned. And it was important to also see that the text of the convention mentions the entire policy cycle from the gender responsive planning, delivery, implementation, and to the monitoring and evaluation stages of the policy process. Also, the next point was about building the synergies between the environmental conservation and the integration of the human rights-based approach and protection of women's rights in particular, while recognizing the specific circumstances of women who live with disabilities, elderly women and girls, and indigenous and local communities. As a whole, the text of the declaration is quite progressive, and it captures the latest thinking in the field, and actually it paved the way for more gender integrated policies in this area. However, on the next slide, I also would like to bring to your attention the challenges that have been reported in the national review report that was submitted prior to the conference. And I would like to say that the number of national reports that provided information on gender and environment has significantly increased in this round of review reports if we compare it to the previous round, which was prepared for Beijing+20 review process. And then many of the governments have been referring to very similar challenges, such as unbalanced access to resources. Women are vulnerable to climate change in many cases because they don't have the equal access to resources. They are dependent on for livelihood on the climate vulnerable sectors. They work in those industries that are at the forefront of the negative climate impact. Climate change also leads to the increase in the unpaid care work by women. Governments were also talking about the gender blind policies and the need to prepare the gender responsive environment and climate policies at all levels. There was also a point on the need for the inclusive participatory processes, covering the institutional arrangements and also the legal provisions for such processes that would open up the possibility for women, for different social groups, indigenous populations as well, to share their voice and insights and contribute to the policy development process. Another aspect is the increased evidence in violence linked to the climate-related conflicts, tensions, and the natural disaster hazards. Of course, the point on the lack of evidence, lack of sex disaggregated data and information has already been mentioned a few times today and yesterday. And this is also a major gap area in the area of environment and climate change. There's not sufficient evidence base that would allow us to monitor the progress, but to also give sufficient qualitative and quantitative basis to demonstrate the differences in impacts on men and women. And then unpaid workload has also been increased due to the impact of climate change. There were a number of studies done that confirmed that the number of hours that women spent to fetch water, to find the cooking fuels, to collect the food has increased due to the severe climate conditions and, for example, lack of water. So on the next slide, you will see the amazing panel, the photos and the short bios of our key note speaker and the panelists. Huda, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so while the slide is, yeah, there's some technical problem, but anyway, I will move on. So I'm very happy to share that we'll have 6 people speaking at this session today. We'll have a keynote speaker and 5 panelists who represent the government, the civil society organizations, and the UN agencies working at the regional and the global level. And each of them will share their views and perspectives on the impact on women of climate change and environmental degradation, and how those impacts were exacerbated, and also what should be done in order to improve this situation. So I don't see my slides, but I guess they have disappeared. But anyway, I would like to introduce the outline of the session. So we'll have a little bit over an hour until 12. Right after my intervention, we'll have the keynote address, and then we'll move to the panel discussion. And I will invite my dear panelists to share their views. And I have prepared the guiding questions, which have been shared with them before the meeting. Basically, the questions are about the impacts of environmental degradation on women, how those impacts were exacerbated, and then noting the priority actions that have already been included in the ministerial declaration, which policies should be prioritized, and which actions should be done by the non-state actors such as civil society and private sector, international community. And I also asked them to share any examples and some good practices of innovative policies that have already emerged in the few months of our new reality. And also if they could demonstrate that the COVID recovery measures should be designed to be more inclusive. Okay, so now we see the bios and the photos of our keynote speaker and the panelists. It's a mixed group of people. Yeah, so Hulda, we can move on to the next slide with the outline. I have already explained how we are going to work today, and I also have explained the questions, so maybe we can project the questions now. Yeah, so this is the guiding questions. And then after we have the interactive session with our panelists, then I will open the floor for the interventions and commentary and questions from the chat. My colleague Irina Harvester will help me monitoring the chat space, and then she will give a very succinct summary of the commentary and explain which questions have been posed. So without any further ado, I'm going now to give the floor to our distinguished keynote speaker. This is Mrs. Angie Dazé, and Angie is connecting with us from Canada, so it's really very late for her, and I'm really grateful that she spent this night hours with all of us. Angie is an associate and resilience and climate change adaptation expert at the International Institute on Sustainable Development. She is a member of the National Adaptation Plan Global Network Secretariat. Her work focuses on policy and practice relating to climate change adaptation and resilience building, particularly in relation to the National Adaptation Plan processes. And Angie also is a gender core lead for the Global Network on Adaptation. Angie, I see your presentation is on.
Great.
Please take it.
Thank you very much, Inkar. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you for this important conversation tonight. So I've been asked to provide a brief introduction to climate change and gender in the context of COVID-19. And in providing these remarks, I'll be drawing on insights from work that ISD has been doing through the National Adaptation Plan Global Network. This is a global initiative that aims to advance adaptation action in the Global South, and gender has been a priority theme for the network since 2017. So although this work has focused on adaptation, I think the learning is applicable to climate action more broadly, as well as environmental conservation. Next slide, please. To start, I just wanted to briefly highlight some of the gendered impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think many of these have already been touched upon by Inkar and in the previous session. So what we're seeing is that the roles and responsibilities that people play influence their level of exposure to the virus. So for example, women make up a large proportion of health workers, so they're more exposed. We're also seeing evidence that the pandemic has led to an increase in women's unpaid care work and in gender-based violence. There may be barriers in access to health and social support services, including those related to sexual and reproductive health and domestic violence. And this may be either due to the distancing measures that have been put in place or due to redirection of resources to respond to COVID-19. Finally, those with precarious employment, including women employed in the informal sector, are most affected by the lockdowns and the economic downturn. Next slide, please. For those of us who work on gender and climate change, these issues are very familiar. There are many common themes between the gendered impacts of climate change and those of COVID-19. First, it's clear that in both crises, people's exposure to risk and their vulnerability is influenced by their gender. In times of stress or scarcity, women generally carry a disproportionate burden due to their unpaid care work. Women and marginalized groups may face additional barriers in accessing the information, resources, and services they need to manage risks and respond to negative impacts. And there are personal security risks in terms of gender-based violence, which has also been found to increase when people are facing scarcity or displaced by natural disasters. Gender differences in financial and livelihood security influence people's resilience to shocks and stresses, whether climate-related or health-related. And the impacts of both COVID-19 and the climate crisis are exacerbated for people who face discrimination due to their age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or other factors, as well as those who have physical disabilities. Next slide, please. So, COVID-19 makes an even stronger case for a gender-responsive approach to climate action. And in our work on gender-responsive national adaptation plan processes, we realized that there was a lack of a common understanding of what gender-responsive adaptation involves. So we developed a simple framework, which you can see here, and I think this framework can really be applied when thinking about climate action more broadly. As you'll see on the slide, there are 3 elements, and I'm just going to go through these one by one and give a bit more background. So next slide, please. The first element is about understanding and addressing the differing needs and capacities of people of all genders and social groups to engage in climate action. The reality is that people experience the impacts of climate change differently based on the roles and responsibilities they play in their households and communities. For example, a fisherman will be differently affected by a cyclone than a woman working in a coastal resort. As well, at the local level, many of the impacts of climate change are felt through natural systems such as freshwater, oceans, and forests. So there are close linkages between ecosystem health and the resilience of people. And issues of access to and control over ecosystem services become very important here. Next, as I mentioned, there may be gender differences in both perception of and exposure to risk based on socially constructed ideas of what it means to be male or female. There is also the issue of gender-based violence, which I've already mentioned. On the positive side, women and men have unique knowledge, as Inkar has already highlighted, that they can apply to the challenge of addressing climate change. So all of this means that climate action efforts need to consider the full range of roles and responsibilities and incorporate diverse knowledge in order to be effective. In general, discriminatory social norms and systemic inequalities exacerbate vulnerability to climate change. However, we do need to avoid unhelpful generalizations about the particular vulnerability of women and marginalized groups. It's about understanding why some people are more vulnerable than others and addressing those underlying causes. And I think this comes out clearly in the declaration. We also need to recognize that this is dynamic. Contexts, norms, and behaviors change over time, requiring ongoing analysis and adjustment. Next slide, please. This brings us to the next element, which is about gender equitable participation in decision-making. Here, as Inkar has highlighted, available data clearly shows that women remain underrepresented at all levels in decision-making related to climate change. At the institutional level, the World Bank reported in 2019 that globally less than 30% of senior positions in the public sector are occupied by women. Similarly, in the private sector, women remain the minority in senior management roles. At the local level, women are underrepresented in governance structures, including those for land management, forestry, and fisheries. And within households, decisions about the allocation of resources are often taken by male heads of household based on their priorities. The obstacles to equal participation include legal and institutional barriers, access to education, and sociocultural norms and practices. Overall, we have found that the people around the table have a strong influence over how problems are framed and how solutions are developed. Gender balance and social expertise are essential for an inclusive approach to climate action. Next slide, please. The third piece is looking at who is benefiting from investments in climate action, and importantly, who is not benefiting and why not. There are a number of factors that represent barriers to women being able to receive equitable benefits. For example, though there has been considerable progress in recent years, female illiteracy rates remain high in many countries, including some in the Asia-Pacific region. This affects their ability to access information, to pursue new livelihood strategies, and to participate in climate action. As well, women tend to have less access to technologies. For example, in South Asia, women are 23% less likely to own a mobile phone than men, based on recent data. They're also less likely to have access to agricultural extension and financial services, and as I mentioned, often have less control over household financial assets. We also see local level actors, including women's groups and other community-based organizations, struggling to access resources for collective action. These are really the building blocks of climate action, and there remain large gender gaps to be overcome. What all of this means is that investments in climate action must be targeted to address historic and persistent inequalities while building resilience for the future. Without attention to equity in these investments, there is a risk that the most vulnerable people will be left behind. Next slide, please. To close, I just wanted to share a few ideas on the key actions that can be taken for a gender-responsive approach to climate action, with an emphasis on building resilience to current and future shocks and stresses in the aftermath of COVID-19. First, action must be informed by disaggregated data and gender analysis. These are the foundation for gender-responsive action. Related to this, we need to avoid generalizations about women and men. An intersectional approach is needed to ensure that strategies are inclusive. We need to focus on process, considering issues around who is at the table, how decisions are made, and how success is defined. This is often about creating opportunities for dialogue among different types of actors, including those focusing on climate change, gender, and health. Gender is important not only at the local level. We need to understand and address institutional barriers, policy gaps, and missed opportunities for better policy alignment. It's absolutely essential that we invest in the capacities of women, non-binary people, and people who face discrimination to facilitate their meaningful participation in climate action. We need to recognize that these challenges cannot be overcome in the short term or through a single project. A long-term systemic view is needed. Monitoring, evaluation, and integration of learning help to avoid unintended negative impacts and to adjust strategies over time. And finally, gender must be considered in decisions about finance, whether through domestic budgeting processes by governments, private sector investment, or through international climate finance. Next slide, please. I will stop there, but I hope that these thoughts will be useful in framing the discussions to follow, and I very much look forward to hearing the rest of the conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Angie. Thank you for setting the scene for our conversation, and also for already now suggesting some recommendations that could take us forward in this process, and that build on the agreement that was reached in November at the previous ministerial meeting. So I would like now to move to the next part of our program and invite our distinguished panelists to please switch on your microphones and videos so that we all can see you. We'll have 5 people in this panel, and our government representative is Mrs. Kia Khan. She is Joint Secretary and Gender Focal Point at the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change of the Government of Bangladesh. Mrs. Khan was previously posted in different ministries and offices under the field administration in Bangladesh and in the district administrations and departments. She worked at the ministries of trademark registration, public administration, civil society, civil aviation, tourism, and industries. Our next speaker is Ruth Manamara. Ruth represents a number of organizations in India. Ruth, I see that you are here. It would be good if you could switch on your video. And Ruth is the leader of the National Alliance of Women and the National Federation of Dalit Women and the National Center for Labor in India. She is a feminist activist involved in educating, organizing and mobilizing women, Dalits, urban poor and unorganized sector in India. And she has built over the years wide networks with women's organizations, trade unions and various social movements in the country. She also has participated for over 40 years as a resource person in many Asian, global, and the UN conferences dealing with the issues of women, health, peace, labor, indigenous peoples, racism, Dalits, environment, and human rights. Our next speaker will be Noeline Nabulivu. Noeline represents the Pacific sub-region. She's a political advisor and co-founder of the civil society organization Diverse Voices and Action for Equality. Noeline comes from Fiji. She is a feminist grassroots organizer and educator, researcher, policy analyst, activist, advocate, and movement builder in the Fiji, in Pacific, and globally. She's been working in this field for over 35 years. She's leading the organization DIVA, which undertakes grassroots feminist work and co-convenes several networks and coalitions. She's also a member of the Global UNDP Civil Society Advisory Committee, and she participates in a number of technical working groups in the Pacific on the gender and on the gender coordination and various other technical groups and funds. Then our next panelist is Mr. Mazharul Alam. He is our partner from UN Environment Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, where Babu coordinates the regional program on climate change for Asia and the Pacific. She leads the UNEP's work on strategic and technical design and implementation of climate change actions. She also has represented UN in the climate change negotiations for over 2 decades and coordinated the work of the adaptation group of G77 and China countries when he was a member of the government of Bangladesh. Fleur Newman is our last speaker on the panel. She's the lead of the unit on action empowerment, and she's the UNFCCC gender focal point and the focal point for women at the Climate Change Secretariat. Fleur leads the intergovernmental work on gender and climate change under the UN Climate Convention and Paris Agreement. So we have a very exciting lineup of people who have agreed to share their views on how climate change affects women and how women inequalities manifest themselves in the climate and environmental management policy space, and also how the situation has exacerbated due to the COVID-19 impact, and which actions should be put in place in addition to current commitment framework. So I would like to ask my first panelist, Mrs. Khan, to please take the floor and share with us your views as the representative of the government of Bangladesh, and also to share what government has already done to respond to this crisis and what else you think should be done by the state actors in order to address this there's actually triple crisis. We're talking about the health crisis, the climate crisis, and the gender gap crisis. Mrs. Khan.
Thank you very much, Inkar, for giving me the floor. And I welcome you all to my part of speaking. And I will not focus on the impacts, because all these impacts on women on climate change and COVID-19 has already been exhausted by Angie. And so I can share about what government has done, Bangladesh government has done in this regard in climate change, and climate change to include gender component. And the government of Bangladesh prepared and adopted the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy Action Plan, BCCP, in 2009. And there are 6 thematic area and BCCP with 44 programs. Among the 44 programs, program P9, livelihood protection of vulnerable socioeconomic groups, including women, under T1, food security, social protection and health, and P4, strengthening gender consideration in climate change management. Under Team T6, capacity building and institutional strengthening are directly attributed and undertaken from climate change task and implemented by the Department of Women Affairs. And the Climate Change and Gender Action Plan was formulated in 2013 under Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change with the technical support of IUCN. It was a 5-year action plan. The aim of this action plan was to ensure gender equality and ensure inclusion into climate change, into related policy strategy and intervention. The action plan emphasized the intent to empower women and respond to the needs of the often invisible other half of the population in the context of climate change in Bangladesh. And the participant from UN Women is here. So he knows that very well, that this year in February 2020, from National Climate Change Task Fund are having a pilot project have been undertaken to review and update the climate change and gender action plan, Bangladesh Climate Change Task, and UN Women will jointly implement the project at the field level. Under this project, a separate gender guideline will develop for climate change task funded project in Bangladesh. Moreover, some women-led climate change activities will be implemented at the field level as a pilot basis under this project. And Bangladesh government also have NAPA. In 2005, Bangladesh prepared the National Adaptation Program of Action to address the adverse impact of climate change, include action increasing the resilience of vulnerable groups, including women and children, by scaling up community level adaptation, diversifying livelihoods, and providing better access to basic services and social protection. And we also have nationwide climate, also have conducted nationwide climate vulnerability assessment in Bangladesh, which was held in December 18 with technical assistance of GIZ. It is based on flood-prone areas, and which has gender aspect of vulnerability was considered as cross-cutting issue in this assessment. And our Department of Environment also has initiated the National Adaptation Plan Formulation Project, and health and gender issue will be considered as a cross-cutting issue in this plan. And NDC, you know about NDC, Nationally Determined Contribution. NDC implementation roadmap and update about that Bangladesh prepared this in 2015, containing 5% unconditional and additional 10% conditional contribution from her business as usual scenario, and also prepared NDC implementation roadmap and sectoral action plan in industry, power and transport 2018. And actually, there is no dedicated chapter on gender now in NDC, but we are considering that Then the gender issue will be incorporated during the period of NDC review and update. And also, we have National Women Development Policy. It is developed by our Ministry of Women, Child and Child Affairs, and which propose strategies for the protection of women and children before, during, and after disaster. It advocates special measures to promote the overall safety and security of women and children in pre-disaster situation. The policy places special programmatic emphasis on women's health as well as on food availability during post-disaster emergencies. And we also have National Food Policy 7 5-year plan. And one good thing we have adopted, that gender responsive budget. GOP has introduced gender responsive budget in 2005 and as an effort to mainstream gender issues in all policies and decision making. A set of guidelines has also been issued to ensure development projects are prepared and reviewed in a gender sensitive way. The number of ministries undergoing gender-based budget has increased to 43 in financial year 2019 from 4 in financial year 2010. The share of expenditure on women development as proportion of total budget increased to 29.65% in financial year 2019. And we also have some good practices that gender integration into adaptation and mitigation and disaster risk reduction and other projects. That's we have mitigation costs. We have social forestry. We have social forestry system that the people who are they are planting trees in the remote area or the village, and they are getting benefit from that. And that 50% of that benefit are going to women. So social forestry project is benefiting women in Bangladesh very much. And in the case of disaster risk reduction, our Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief and implement a number of women-focused and gender-sensitive programs that promote CCA and DRR. The Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief Secretariat implements a program titled Creation of Employment for the Ultra-Poor, especially poor, destitute women in identified disaster-prone areas. Meanwhile, implementation of the FFWTR and EGPP and the distribution of food and cash and house building grants support both women development and women employment to improve their adaptive capacity in face of climate change and to reduce their risk from disaster. And also our Ministry of Women and Children Affairs implement allowances for working lactating mothers, maternity allowances for the ultra poor and pregnant women, and food assistance to vulnerable women under VGD programs. And we have other good practices that Ministry of Women and Children Affairs has taken an initiative under Bangladesh Climate Change Trust to help other ministries to integrate gender sensitivity in their respective project designs. And also adaptation activities, dissemination of early warning by young women volunteers, and also work in response and recovery. Women are exchanging their views with family members and neighbors, planting more trees than before, and taking necessary steps for prepare hour before disaster days. These are the things that government is doing to promote gender sensitive actions in the policy planning, but there are further more things to do. I think, in my opinion, that what about we have seen in the presentation of Angie, that she has mentioned about the investment planning for equitable share for gender equitable investment planning. That I'm also suggesting that in the investment plan of Bangladesh, we should have gender equitable investment plan, and there should be finance for women an equal share of budget allocation for the women in the policy planning. And we have participation of women in different level, in local level and government level, but the decision making role of the women should be increased more. Not only the participation of the women is there, there should be they should be vocal, and their decisions should be incorporated in the policy planning. And we have lots of plans, but I think we have lack of implementation. Lack of implementation of different plan is there. So we have to have implementation of different planning in our policies, and there should be monitoring and review process of the output and outcomes. Thank you very much. I think I have covered my part. Now, if you have any questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Khan. Thank you for sharing those insights. It is really impressive how developed is the policy framework of Bangladesh, and that you have succeeded in mainstreaming gender in a number of policy areas that you mentioned, the climate change, disaster risk reduction, forestry. You also are working at the subnational district level. You also have institutionalized the allocation of budget, targeted budget for women-centered activities. And we all are looking to receive the national determined contribution, the updated submission from Bangladesh, and we really hope that gender will be well integrated in this, in the next commitment period for Bangladesh. I was happy to hear that you share the views that Angie already has mentioned, that it's important to increase the investment flow for implementation of gender sensitive policies. And of course, through by allocating more funds for such programs, we'll be able to ensure the implementation of the commitments that have been included in the policies. This is really very important.
Sorry,
thank you for bringing this dimension.
I missed
yes,
one
please.
point. I missed one point that I want to mention, that in the project planning, when the developing partners are contributing fund in a specific project, there should be a specific indicator and specific component about gender. So there should be a specific indicator. In each and every project, there is gender component there, but you know, when in implementing that component, in every case, most of the cases we have seen that the gender component, that the specific thing is not been focused. It's been underlying. So there should be, we should have specific indicator to focus on gender, and how that can be benefit the women in from that specific project.
Thank you for bringing this additional point. But in the interest of time, I would like to move to our next speakers, and I would like to ask Ruth Banamara from India to share with us your views on the impacts of climate and environmental degradation on women, and on how this was exacerbated due to the COVID, and also what has been done already by the civil society and should be done more in order to address this dire situation. Ruth, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much, Inka, for inviting me to this important session on women and sustainability, women's participation in environmental sustainability initiatives. I actually represent here the organization which works with the Dalits at a national level, as well as on an Asian level, and also at a global level. I think the fallout of the novel coronavirus or COVID-19 pandemic has been alarming, and the consequences are extreme. Nearly a month later, in the early days of March, the WHO declared the disease is a global pandemic, a public health disaster. That is what the world is battling with right now. While impacts of environmental degradation and climate change on gender have been debated for long among policymakers and practitioners, now it is widely acknowledged that COVID-19 has aggravated those existing challenges and heightened risks. On this, government and civil society organizations around the world are aware of the impacts and implication of the COVID-19 on environment and climate change on women, including those engaged as farm laborers, migrants, healthcare providers, and domestic workers, and have warned about the urgent need to look at existing realities from gender and intersectional perspectives that allow for the identification of these inequalities, and at the same time incorporate greater protection and assistance to more vulnerable populations in response plans. What are the key challenges that we are facing right now? Climate change and environmental degradation represent a great threat to poverty reduction and to achieve the SDGs goals. It impacts health, food security, nutrition, protection, production, and people's earning of men and women differently. Given the traditional roles in agriculture production and the procures of water, cooking fuel, and other household resources, women are not only more impacted by the challenges, but are also well suited to find solutions to prevent further degradation and adapt to the challenging climate. So my first key challenge, I think that climate change and environmental degradation represent a great threat to poverty. For example, the communities that I work in India, I just looked at the statistics. The scheduled caste community, that are Dalits, are 54%, and among SDs, that is indigenous people, the tribals, 35.65%, landless olds, a major part of they derived major part of their income from land, working in land, income from manual casual labor, and many of them turned to begging in the census of 2011 itself. Furthermore, 83.55% of Dalits and 86.53% of the tribal households have their highest earning members that income less than rupees 5,000. That is less than 100 US dollars, much lesser than 100 US dollars. The COVID-19 pandemic decimated even these delicate means of sustenance for these two communities have really gone down. Indebtedness, exploitation, not only to harm that ensnares them, women, child, elderly persons with disability facing additional difficulties, drudgery, neglect, and risk of violence at each step. So I think that you can see the poverty reduction is now, it's not reducing, it's aggravating. The second point that I wanted to make, the challenge is the climate change and environmental degradation impacts more women than men. Many of us know this. Pre-COVID-19, UN report 2019 says that close to 2.9 billion people, of whom a large majority are women, in the developing world still use fuels like wood, coal, and charcoal. A global study concluded that about 2/3 of women, those displaced by floods and disasters, were women, exacerbating existing gender disparities. Third, I wanted to say COVID-19 has exposed the deepening fault lines in the existing political economic systems that discriminates women with regard to access and ownership of land and resources. Asia-wide, women only own less than 2% of property and resources. Globally, women only own only 1%. Thus, intervening crisis of inequality, climate change, and environmental destruction, all of these impact on women, on their lives and livelihoods during this seasons particularly. Diminishing access to land and natural resources have often resulted in gender-based violence and exploitation. The fourth point I wanted to say what would be the challenges are the political and economic systems that are producing inequalities and are also driving the destruction of nature, and climate change place excess burden on women in their role as homemakers, caregivers, and workers. COVID-19 has drawn attention to the fact that pandemics are a consequence of large-scale human destruction of nature, driven by extractives, growth-obsessed economic systems. The political economic system, after years of government austerity and privatization, have weakened the public health, social security, housing, education, and food services and institutions that are so crucial to tackling inequality and responding to pandemics and climate-induced disasters. Impacts of environmental degradation and climate change are more pronounced on women in settings that are simultaneously affected by violent conflicts. Second, political instability and economic strife. We have around Asia, we can see there is a lot of political and economic strifes are going on. I think that I've covered most of the challenges that we are facing right now. What is important is that impact of climate change on COVID-19 on migrant women workers has been severe and long-lasting on environment. Many women are also employed in the highly feminized sectors, such as healthcare, domestic work, entertainment, manufacturing, and textiles in destination countries such as Japan, Korea, Middle East, Europe, Canada, Malaysia, and Singapore. Thus, women are vulnerable not just because of their age and lack of voice, but also because of the type of work they are engaged in: domestic work, home-based healthcare, entertainment, and service sectors, and lack of adequate protection when they face environment and socio-economic challenges. COVID-19 crisis had an immediate impact on homemakers and those women engaged in informal sector of work. That is another area that I work. We can see how, the women in informal sector are suffering and how they have to walk miles and miles during COVID, to reach their places for safety and security. So sudden loss of jobs and income sources with shelters in place or stay-at-home rules imposed in most cases. Border closures and lockdowns have significantly limited the movement of essential goods and people that place additional caregiving burden on women. The consequences of the lockdown have not been equal across our societies, as we saw, for instance, in India, where millions of women in formal sector were forced to flee on foot to their home villages when the lockdown abruptly eradicated their livelihoods and rendered them destitute. We were informed yesterday that our government do not know how many migrants have died during their walking to their, to their hometowns. So what are the solutions? What are the solution could be? I think the solution could be environmental justice. I think responses to climate crisis, first of all, must be critically analyzed and climate justice repoliticized as a feminist issue through challenging the ahistorical, market-based and neoliberal solutions to environmental degradation, which replicate power inequalities for women and marginalized groups in the global south. We must interrogate working of power at multiple levels, acknowledge the intersections of gender with other identities, and recognizing that these have implicated for the use of resources and capacity to adapt to disasters for women and marginalized communities. We must also explore how human rights standards, such as those under CEDAW and CESCR, can plug the current framework gaps from rights affirming and feminist perspectives. We must also build on the achievements of the women's and environmental justice movements in extensively documenting the differential impact on women and girls of environmental degradation and climate change, and advocating for greater participation of women in decision-making spaces. Above all, we must work in solidarity with women who are most affected by environmental degradation and climate change, amplifying their voices every step of the way. I already said that what are, the concluding solutions would be: humanize the new environment resource rights narrative by focusing social economic development on the objective of increasing participation of women in different decision-making arenas. I am reiterating what I said in the opening remarks. Foster diversity and inclusive gender concern in progressing Beijing plus 20 as well as the SDGs. Engaging with partnership in broader constituency of gender activists, including landless and small-scale farmers. Also, we must build the capacity of meso-level institutions below the level of the national government and above the level of, individuals. I think women are also capable mostly in rural women, peasants, agriculture laborers, and Dalit and, the tribal women whom I work with, believes that women have a special link to biodiversity and are the best custodians of Earth through their knowledge and heterogeneity of life. Diversity as central to women's work and knowledge. Women are often the people who are most directly involved in subsistence work and are the safeguards of natural resources needed to sustain the family and community. This must be preserved and protected. Women have intrinsically interdependent and complex relationship with the environment, and they play a critical role in relation to the natural environment. These have been also legitimized by our famous ecologist and environmental activist Vandana Shiva, that women have the capacity to really link themselves with biodiversity. I think also I wanted to conclude by saying economic justice is so much linked with environmental economic justice, so much linked to gender justice. Therefore, I think women should be at the center of, discussion. Experiences suggest that bilateral and multilaterals like UN, World Bank, ADB, etc. will be limited help if they would not involve the grassroots communities. Finally, women-driven social entrepreneurial should work with governments, private sector, and civil society to see how their ideas and business modes are financed. It is hard but achievable if social capital is built at the local level. I think I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for bringing so many valuable points to our conversation and for talking about the linkages to poverty and SDG progress, and also recalling the importance of informal sector and the small and medium enterprises, and also talking about the human rights and the environmental justice and social justice. This is so many valuable angles and perspectives you brought to our conversation. It was really a pleasure to listen to you. And now I would like to move to Noeline. Noeline comes from Fiji, and she represents the Pacific sub-region. This is one of the regions which suffer from the climate change more. It's the region of small island developing states who advocate very loud for reflecting the specific circumstances of those states in the climate change discussion.
Thank you. So Inka, yeah, thank you. I'd like to start mine by just talking about some of the issues and problems, and in the second round, then I'll talk about some of the ways that we're moving some of the tactics and strategies on addressing these. So the bodies and the human rights and the economic and ecological justice of women. And this means talking about women in all of their intersectional diversity, and femme people and transgender and gender non-binary people, and also men and boys in Fiji and the Pacific, and really all climate frontline and islander peoples are really under unprecedented threat right now. And what we're talking about is climate change and environmental damage that really interconnects with the violations on bodily autonomy and integrity, on how our bodies are carried through every day, how we experience or not our human rights, on our safety and security, and the ability for us to experience developmental justice. So it causes movement of people within and across states. It pushes us out of, generational homes and a connection to a particular place, and it causes the movement of entire villages. It's also about our human impact on other species and natural systems, and it really does. The importance of this meeting is that it helps us to lay bare some of those deep roots and the gaps and obstacles that we've faced as movements in this 25 years since the Fourth Conference of Women, in the 12 critical areas, but also beyond. And the first thing to kind of raise is that the climate and natural system breakdown is really a consequence of many long-term decisions that are made by various actors, whether it's the states and the governments that come and go within those states, corporations and different kinds of businesses, whether micro, small or medium enterprises, the development agencies that are particularly a big part of our lives in the Pacific, and the communities that we have over decades and centuries, our decisions as well as individuals and communities. So that means that the solutions are also multifaceted, and they have to be across all the territories, whether they're about bodies or our commons. What we're talking a lot about now is around, what is the state of our air and our water and our soil and our land and our oceans and our reefs and our biodiversity as commons that we all require in order to live as species on this planet. And many of the policies that actually have been adopted since the beginning of, our independent states here in the Pacific as elsewhere around the world, we really have to look at those gendered and rooted problems, which are around epistemologies that include sexism, racism, issues of imperialism and heteropatriarchy, and what we want to keep talking about in the feminist spaces as the continuing colonial project. These things still are often invisible and unchallenged. But so just as we're saying we're not post-COVID at all, we're also not post-colonialism, post-patriarchy, or post-heteronormativity. So in the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and across Asia, we really have a lot of marketization and commodification and hyperdevelopment of the state. But we also have some of the remaining colonial and occupied territories and ceded indigenous territories. And the people in those territories, including in West Papua and elsewhere, are really suffering every day from state and non-state violence and exclusion and marginalization, and now also then from pandemics, climate change, and disasters. So the commons and biodiversity of the Pacific as elsewhere is under threat from many things. That includes overfishing, poor land use and agricultural runoff, unsustainable forest management, mangrove removal, and maybe when we're replacing mangroves, not doing it in a way that really we should be, some ad hoc replacements, poor waste management practices, introduction of invasive alien species, and in particular, the habitat destruction of the coastal areas. And that has an impact on all kinds of ecosystems, whether they're estuaries, coral reefs, and foreshore ecosystems. And then meanwhile, in the middle of this, we still find ourselves in a kind of false logic, not just in the Pacific, but around the world, of this competitive interest between economic and ecological sustainability, as Ruth talked about. And so governments still, draft legislation and policy as if healthy economies are possible without healthy ecosystems, and as if they're externalities, and we all know they're not. And what we see around us tells us that that frame's entirely wrong. And I just wanted to pick up on 5 or 6 quick things, which is, we know we have record temperatures regularly now. We know we have global sea level rise. We have 100 to 200 species a day going extinct. 70% of rainforests and arboreal forests are under threat. 90% of coral reefs gone by 2030 at the current rate. And if that happens, then likely we also lose the last remaining 10% of healthy tuna fisheries. The ocean system's changing, rising areas of anoxic ocean, so the oxygen is out of there now, or levels are decreasing, and methane hydrates being released at the poles. We also have weakened marine carbon pump, ocean currents and slowing jet streams, disappearing Arctic summer ice, insects, bees, and frogs are disappearing. And the reason why I'm saying this is because while we had a pandemic that exacerbates all of this, it is part of that problem about climate change, and disasters are a symptom of everything that is going on in the natural world. The pandemic whether by design or accident, from our work on climate urgent action. And that includes all kinds of work that women are doing. That includes mitigation, adaptation, response to localized loss and damage, technology development, not just transfer, but development, and the multilateral efforts for climate finance. And by this, I mean not just drips and not just loans, but grants that are about intergenerational equity and compensation for past wrongs. But a gender-just multilateral funding ecosystem is required now that really reflects both the realities and what we need in our response. So in Fiji right now, all our borders are closed. As across the Pacific, there's a major loss of trade, almost no tourism now, and over 150 people out of work, and over 50,000 children, including the girl child, not in school in the second half of this year. So some of the things that DIVA and others are already doing now is providing 3,000 meals per week, and TSI Sangam and many other faith groups and other groups are putting together those, and food packages and non-conditional cash transfers for rent assistance. And we're not even touching the edges of the problem of rising hunger and malnutrition and the rollbacks in some of our hard-gained developmental gains. There are massive reductions in remittances right now, low capital flows, tight financial conditions, and the debt is piling up. So we have to talk also about debt cancellation and debt relief. Then we had a severe tropical cyclone Harold in April that meant even more closure of the state. For instance, we had inter-island vessels closed down, and massive direct housing and other loss and damage faced by communities. So Fiji, like other states in the national budget, one of the things it did was it removed some of the regulatory barriers for new businesses. It removed stamp duty and more, which is in line with the demands of the World Bank State of Doing Business, which is the same report that's now under review for questionable measurement. So one of the things that we have to talk about, and as feminist Diane Elson talks about, is that any state capitulations that we're seeing right now to existing, global financial economic systems is not really about austerity or stimulus, because you can't actually stimulate something that is a closed economy or a disabled economy. But they're in fact mitigation budgets, she says, and we haven't even hit the real pain threshold yet for states. So one of the things that we have to be real about is this is not about post anything. agricultural markets facing trade restrictions, supply chain disruptions. There's already concerns about food security issues in some places in the Pacific, particularly those with high food imports. And should COVID border closures persist for 18 months or 2 years or more, which many policy analysts are talking about, the more those border closures are here, the recession and food insecurity and health crises, and the need for really strong, concrete, and calculated state responses need to go much deeper. Women in their businesses find it hard to service debt right now. We're already seeing, that all manner of bankruptcies and defaults start to occur within the system. And I know at least 4 major hotels that are changing hands in Fiji right now, and that's only the ones we know about. So this is not even about competitive strategy right now for industries within the Pacific who are facing both climate change and COVID, but it's about survival. Who can stay afloat the longest? When 1/6 of the employment is largely wiped out, and then the temporary period keeps extending, then we have urgent work. That means that people are afraid, women are afraid, they're seeing a quick erosion of their resources. They don't know when this will change. That necessitates psychosocial care, for instance. It also means that for women who are already heavily affected by violence and discrimination, in Fiji, we have levels of violence against women that are over 65%, 2 in 3 women. And 84% of all LGBTQ women and people say that they've experienced sexual violence. And this is then exacerbated by stress and scarcity. And in this culture where we have women's care work is gendered, it's hierarchicized, it's not recognized by the state or non-state, and it's not redistributed, women are becoming exhausted. And we don't have those social flaws, social protection and social infrastructure taken seriously enough by all of us, and things will decline quickly. It's not often I quote from the World Bank, but they say that since the beginning of the pandemic, that 36.9% of countries haven't developed any new unemployment or special allowance and grants. 55% haven't introduced any additional sickness or health protections. 54% haven't provided any novel new income protection measures. 62% haven't implemented any food or nutrition measures. And only 29% have introduced child or family allowances. So we all need to be clearer that while we keep talking about the recuperation of the development state, and we say that some of these issues that have happened with COVID allow us those gaps in which to move and to do things differently, but really what we require is much more than that. It's a reimagining and a reconfiguration of states that correct a lot of these major deficiencies of the current micro, macro, meso and macro ecological and economic paradigms. And we need that women-led groups and social movements are in there and able to be the vanguards for change, because we can often be the ones who are going before and beyond governments where we're needed, helping to push political will and to assist with maybe narrative shifts, to partner with them and to provide other technical support, as well as ongoing leadership in communities on gender, DRR, and humanitarian response. And this includes ensuring that gender justice and universal human rights and progressive policies and initiatives are, yes, taken back, but we work out how we are going to do that in real time and very, very fast, urgently, here in Pacific Small Island states, but across the world. And I think I'll leave it there, and then I'll talk a little more specifically about some of the ways we can see some glimmerings of hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Nalin. Really very amazing everything that you have talked about. It was interesting to hear from you the way you understand this compound impact of long-term and long-term injustices and short-term challenges, and how our past and geopolitical history still impacts and affects us. And it was also interesting for me to hear about the failures and gaps in the public sector and lack or poor social protection and social infrastructure systems, and how it is linked to suffering of so many people in the Pacific. But I also appreciate what you said about the reconfiguration of the governance system, the way we know it. I know that many are talking about the need to reshape or redesign the climate action, the governance systems. So this COVID actually demonstrated to us all the tensions and inequalities and how poor our current governance system is, and that it probably is also an opportunity for us to adjust our frameworks, hopefully in the near future. Nolene, I'm not sure we'll have the time for the second round, but I also want to give the floor to our other speakers, and then maybe if time permits, then you would have the opportunity to contribute once more. So thank you again. Babu, I call you Babu. I hope I have the right. We've been working for so many years together. I wanted to give the floor to you now and to hear what's your take on the impact and on maybe more on the solutions, on what should be put in place now that we already know how significant the impacts are on women. And here we're talking about like double burden of women suffering from the climate change and also from the COVID impact.
Thank you, Inka. Thank you, colleagues and friends. I think a good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are attending. After hearing Angie and your introduction, as well as other panel members, I'd like to focus on maybe the three key areas, and those are connected with the main questions that you have actually posed to the panel members. But the first one, in terms of the impacts of the environmental degradation and climate change on the women, and I'd like to actually talk more on understanding the impacts and why the disaggregated the data that we are actually talked about played an important role in the decision making. And I'd like to just frame that within the context of the environmental degradation and the climate change, and the interrelationship between this environmental degradation, climate change with the women. The first thing that I'd like to mention, as I just said, that how the women depends on the multiple factors, and many panel members actually touched upon many aspects, but I'd like to just focus on the environmental degradation and climate change in terms of their dependence in the context of the livelihood, the regular work that they're involved in, and that connected with the environmental resources and the ecosystem services. And if we look into the land, the water, the forest, the agriculture, etc., and then how those environmental resources are being degraded due to the different factors, as well as the impacts on those natural resources due to the climate change. So that is the first part in terms of understanding the impact in more disaggregated manner in terms of the relationship, but also important to understand the underlying the conditions and the situation. And then many colleagues talked about those, and I'd like to just maybe highlight a couple of those. In terms of the unequal land and the tenure rights, if we look into the natural resources, their engagement in the different the sectors, including the informal sectors. We also heard about this, the unequal access to the livelihood assets, and also the limited opportunity to participate in the decision making. So all those aspects are actually very important in terms of when we are talking about the disaggregated data, the information, and bringing those together to understand the impacts and taking the decision. So I'd like to just focus on why the disaggregated data, and this not only the disaggregated data when we are talking about the women, the age, the sex, the job, but I think we also need to actually bring the information also on the underlying conditions and the prevailing situation. So that part I'd like to just highlight, and I'd like to just give the example that why we also cannot generalize. And then we have heard about the risk of generalization. Now, if I take the example of Southeast Asian countries, and several countries, they even use the term called the feminization of the agriculture, because the large number of the women are involved in agriculture. And if we look into the Cambodia, for as an example, if I'm not mistaken, it is within the 60 to 80% the women are involved in the wholesale and the retail trade of the agricultural product. But if we look into the South Asia, this is not exactly the same picture. So we also need to look into the very context specific and avoiding the risk of the generalization. But also if we look into this, the disaggregated data and information, there are also the missing information, the way we are actually collecting the data and putting those data in our statistical system. I can give an example. If we look into the Myanmar, in terms of the for-harvest, the processing, the marketing of those products, selling, etc., of the fisheries, those information are not available. So how to also generate the data, how to influence our statistical system to generate that data. So those are the important elements that I'd like to just mention and give some examples on this, the importance. Now, if we look into this, the whole aspect of the COVID and its impact on the women, you have heard the several already. And if we look into the research carried out, and most of the research are primarily focusing right now on the economic assessment and the impacts of the COVID. And we have the rapid assessment on the social side, but the very limited number of the comprehensive assessment is available on the COVID impacts on the social and the socio-economic system, as well as on the women. But if we look into the rapid assessment carried out, even one of the assessment carried out by the Empower project, as Inka you have mentioned, which is the joint project of UN Women and UNEP, what we have seen in that rapid assessment in terms of the impact is, one is if we look into the informal job, which I mentioned, is basically they are not registered, is unregistered, the small business. And then when the government provided the stimulus package for the business sector, and when it is unregistered, you are not actually in the picture to get the benefit. Even if you look into the small shops that they're running, is the damage happen of the product or the goods they were having at that time. Because of the lockdown, there is no sales. And also the excess. So there are several dimensions in terms of the direct impact of the COVID. But if we look into the environmental resources, there are several studies that yes, the environment is getting better, the greenhouse gas emission has lowered it down. But the benefit that we're seeing in terms of the environmental resources, the greenhouse gas emission, are basically is in a very short term. And it's not going to sustain unless we actually bring the changes and transform the way we are actually operating. And then we have several learnings from the COVID. Now the whole issue is moving to your third point in terms of the priority action. Is how to incorporate the good learnings from this current situation and then mainstreaming those in the policy making and the action. And then if we look into within the gender context, is the mainstreaming gender aspect in all aspect of the business, and need to be the responsibility of all. Not to ignore a small, as you all know, if we aggregate the many smalls, it is going to be larger than one large sector. So we cannot ignore even if it's something small. Now, within the UNEP, what our organization has come up with is called the COVID-19, the strategic, the responses for the UNEP. And it has identified the building blocks. One is obviously, if we look into the medical system, the humanitarian system, as well as the waste that we are generating to address the current pandemic. So how to deal with this, the entire waste, and how to help the humanitarian and the medical emergency, particularly within the context of the waste management. The second area is the transformational change that we require in the context of the nature and in the people. As I mentioned, that if we look into the environmental resources and their dependence, unless we actually bring the strong connection and transform the way we actually operating, we will be going back to the pre-COVID situation, and we need to avoid that situation. Then the third area, and many of the panel member has already talked about the building back better. And then, as I mentioned, that if we look into the small business operated by women, they're not actually in the registration system. So in future, unless they're actually part of that, we'll not able to actually provide the support to them. So we need to think how we are going to building back better all the stimulus package that is operating, but also the recovery, which is going to start in many countries, and some of them has already started. Now, let me end by saying that the fourth dimension, which is also important, is the environmental governance, and then how to bring all the actors in the environmental governance, and then taking the whole society approach to this, the environmental governance at the global level, at the regional level, as well as at the national level. Thank you, Inka.
Thank you so much, Babu, for sharing with us the UNEP strategy on COVID recovery. And yeah, I agree with you with your earlier point that you made about the importance of collecting data and capturing our knowledge, and maybe doing more in-depth research on socioeconomic impacts of COVID on women. Thank you for bringing this to the table as well. And Fleur, I would like now to turn to you and ask you to share with us what is happening at the global level in the climate change negotiations. And if you could share with us maybe a brief update on the progress and implementation of Gender Action Plan under the Convention, and what's the thinking on the linkages between the response to climate and the response to COVID.
Thank you very much, Inka, and for inviting me to this important and stimulating panel today. Our keynote speaker and all my other esteemed panelists have provided a comprehensive list of impacts on women and girls, non-binary people, and other marginalized groups of environmental degradation and climate change, and also in this context, COVID-19. Including the really important context of the need not to overgeneralize and to identify context. Importantly, the differentiated impacts of climate change on women and men has now been officially recognized under the UNFCCC process. Firstly, through a technical paper on this topic published in 2019, which was actually based on the submissions from countries and non-governmental organizations, providing evidence and insight. Differentiated impacts were identified across three broad themes. Firstly, an actual or perceived in the vulnerability of certain individuals, groups, and communities. Secondly, who is involved in decision making and what attitudes are taken towards responses to climate change impacts. And lastly, who benefits from action on climate change impacts. So that was the sort of first piece, was this technical paper. Secondly, in the text of the 5-year Enhanced Lima Work Programme on Gender and its gender agreed by countries to the UNFCCC at COP25 in Madrid in December last year. For the first time, a decision under the process and the COP recognises with concern that climate change impacts on women and men can often differ owing to historical and current inequalities and multidimensional factors, and can be more pronounced in developing countries and for local communities and Indigenous peoples. It's important because it references current inequalities. Nolene provided us with a very powerful summary of the causes of those, and to intersectional or multidimensional factors, which are critical in being able to address this effectively. And it's by all the panelists prior to me. These impacts in relation to how these have been exacerbated by COVID-19, this has also been highlighted very well. And it's clear that COVID-19 also has a differentiated impact on women and gender gaps within both the public and private spheres. However, in many places, it has also revealed an enormous capacity within societies to take collective action and support changes to business as usual for the sake of dealing with public health. Not universally, but there have been some amazing examples of this. And there are lessons to be learned in how the public has responded to this crisis. It has also laid bare the fact that many working in the field of gender equality, a fact that many in the field of gender equality are aware of, our economies are under a core economy of unpaid work and also undervalued work, such as the health and education sectors, that is predominantly undertaken by women and girls almost universally. The lesson is vital for governments and societies to firstly acknowledge and understand it, but then it must inform future action. The devastating recent flooding and storms in this region, in several sub-Saharan countries, and the devastating wildfires raging across Western are daily reminders that we are dealing with multiple crises as we respond to the global pandemic. Climate change has not paused this year and will continue to worsen and intensify, particularly if COVID-19 recovery packages do not apply a climate lens. Resilience from future shocks, health, climate, environment, and economic, need to be built into the investments being directed at economic recovery. That necessarily means addressing climate change and gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment. Climate change and addressing gender equality and inequality are systems issues that require changes, radical changes in some cases, to these systems. As others have mentioned, it cannot be resolved only through isolated and disconnected projects or programs. In terms of priority actions, policy actions that address the causes of inequalities are essential. So barriers to education, financial assets and security, the undervaluing of the informal sector and care work in the formal sector should be priorities. In relation to support, strengthened institutional arrangements and enhancing participatory consultations and policy developments. Many of these things have been raised by panelists prior to me. Likewise, as countries update their national climate plans, so-called nationally determined contributions or NDCs in 2020, as required under the Paris Agreement, they can build in investment in infrastructure and social protection, informed by the lessons from the having to deal with this pandemic, and to enhance preparedness. And this was mentioned previously in the context of Bangladesh. This may mean, for instance, ensuring that the health sector is also part of the NDC, which it may not have been in the past. Strengthening the gender considerations in the energy or transport sector component of the NDC, also areas in which, these are critical areas, but may not have been considered in terms of gender in the past. We recently held a regional workshop on gender integration in national climate. We're actually running a series of regional workshops on gender integration in national climate policies and action as part of one of the activities under the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan, where the issues that were identified by Angie and mentioned by other panelists as being key elements are the focus of the virtual workshop, namely the need for sex disaggregated data and analysis as a foundation for informed climate policy and action, institutional arrangements and coordination mechanisms, both across ministries and also vertically for subnational and local governments. And this must include civil society, grassroots, and Indigenous peoples and communities. And finally, policy alignment and coherence, which also speaks to the need to address systemic issues with systemic solutions, and the need to leverage, build on, and link interrelated policy and action. In the Asia Pacific Regional Workshop held at the end of July, we heard from Nepal about its recently published National Climate Change Policy, which includes gender as a cross-cutting thematic area. The country plans to form a gender equality, social inclusion thematic working group, which will join the Gender Working Group for Forest Biodiversity and Climate Change. This builds on prior analysis that demonstrates the importance of ensuring different types of vulnerabilities, including gender, are specifically considered during program design and program cycle management. The Philippines, beyond integrating gender into the NDC, have reformed institutions and prioritized collaboration between the Climate Change and Women Commission as a means of further creating sustainable, inclusive policy and action. Outside of the region, Spain has announced that its just transition to a green economy includes a focus on gender equality in the energy sector. Again, this is also demonstrates that it's not only in developing countries that we have a need for a focus on gender equality in the context of climate change. It is also it's universal. Globally, we need to be dealing with this. And as a city trialing different economic models that are based on feminist economics, in this case, economics, which advances social, such as unpaid care work and ecological elements, such as net zero carbon emissions, as core economies that make all other elements of the economy work. And this speaks to the need to have different, potentially radical and transformational changes to systems. I'll close on the point that the urgency to address climate change has intensified during the COVID pandemic, not because of it, but rather despite it, simply because time is passing. We need a rapid transition to low carbon, climate resilient, and just economies and societies. And we must learn the lessons of the global health crisis, which has further exposed the inadequacy of business as usual approaches. We have a small window of opportunity, and it is critical that COVID-19 recovery addresses both climate change and gender equality and women's and girls' empowerment. Thanks, Inka.
Thank you so much, Fleur. Yeah, I really appreciate that you brought this aspect of like coherence across the government, but also across the whole society. I think everybody has to be mobilized and take part in the development of the recovery measures. But it is also important to keep track of our climate change commitments and to advocate to governments to include in their recovery packages, not only the economic measures, but also the longer term resilient measures in order to for us to move towards the resilient and just societies, exactly as you said at the end. I would like to, we are already over time, but I saw that the chat box is really full of different questions and commentary, and I wanted to ask my colleague Irina to quickly acknowledge the inputs from our audience and maybe very briefly summarize what are the common threads and what kind of feedback we have received from our audience. Irina?
Thank you, Inkar, and thank you all to all the panelists for the excellent contributions and interventions. And also, dear participants, it was very lively discussion in the chat and valuable comments that we have received from all of you. So as interest of time, I will just summarize a few key points I think were raised. So we had, first of all, many resources being shared about local action, for example, related to agricultural initiatives. And also that it was highlighted that this is what we need more. We need local level action that we can then upscale for a higher level. So really from bottom to up action. There was also many comments about shrinking civil society spaces and how we have to give more spaces for women to be able to connect and share their knowledge about climate action and environmental management as well. And then also budgeting for gender and climate action and mitigation was also touched upon in many of the comments in the chat. So overall, I think it was very, very lively again. And I see also that Babu and Angie have responded specific questions in the chat. So thank you also for that. With this, over to you, Inkar.
Thank you so much, Irina. We ran out of time, unfortunately, and we have to close right away because we have one more session right after us. So I would like to thank you, all the panelists and the meeting participants, for participating in this session. It was very informative. I myself learned a lot. I'm really grateful to our panelists for bringing so many new dimensions and aspects of the impact on women, and also I'm grateful for your recommendations and suggestions on which further additional actions and policy changes are required in order to respond to the climate change crisis and the COVID crisis in a comprehensive way, so that we address the unique needs of girls and women, and we also leverage their unique expertise. With that, I would like to close the session and invite my colleagues to take over and move to the next concluding session of the meeting. Thank you so much.
I think, Chane, you need to unmute.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So thank you, Inka, very much for this very able moderation of session 4 on women and environmental sustainability. And thank you to all the speakers and participants as well for your contributions. We will now be moving into session 5 on looking ahead. The objective of this short final discussion is to together, in addition to what we already have seen coming through in the chat box, to articulate key recommendations for priority actions to implement the outcomes of the Beijing+25 declaration, including in the context of this COVID-19 pandemic. So we encourage you to share your thoughts and ideas on this. This session will be co-facilitated by Ms. Chai Chai, who is ESCAP's Chief of the Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Section, and Ms. Sarah Knips, who is the Deputy Regional Director of the UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. I will invite Ms. Chai Chai to take the floor first, please.
Thank you, Chana. Dear participants, thank you very much for joining us in this virtual expert group meeting and for engaging in a rich dialogue over the past 2 days. Through various sessions, our experts and all the participants have been putting forth very comprehensive recommendations on addressing key priorities for the Asia-Pacific region, and also how to make changes happen at a faster pace, especially considering the COVID pandemic and the urgency, you know, to bring change. And because this crisis has really provided an opportunity to build a new and better society. The dialogue itself is so rich. It is impossible to present all of them in several minutes. So what we will just give a very quick summary, highlight some several recommendations related to each session. And then after the meeting, we will share a more comprehensive report with you. For the first session, our speakers shared innovative initiatives at a national level and reflected on how we can advance in solidarity to put women at the front and center, not only in COVID-19 recovery efforts, but as a long-term strategy to underpin the overall efforts in implementing the 2030 agenda. Going forward in implementing the Beijing+25 declaration, the experts emphasized the importance of regional cooperation and partnerships, building collaborative initiatives, collecting and analyzing gender data, as well as developing monitoring mechanism to support the implementation of the Beijing+25 review outcomes. The experts have also emphasized that gender issues must be positioned at the heart of national development strategy and plan, as well as macroeconomic policy framework. You have also addressed the critical importance of a multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder approach that includes different perspectives from all levels, including from small women's group to national governments, as well as regional actors, and in particular to include the voices of local actors and communities to ensure ownership and effectiveness of measures and programs. Now, in the second session, the experts and participants have put forth key recommendations that stress the importance of recognizing, reducing, and redistributing unpaid care work, as well as to implementing gender-responsive social protection policies. You have further noted the importance of promoting enabling factors for women's economic empowerment, including adopting an ecosystem approach to support women's entrepreneurship, to address multifaceted and interconnected barriers. And furthermore, you highlighted the importance of ensuring women's access to digital tools, especially in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. So I thank all the participants and experts from the government, civil society, academia, and many other stakeholders that have committed to the Beijing+25 Asia-Pacific Declaration, as well as brainstorming on implementing the implementation strategy. We will continue to bring together member states, civil society actors, private sector, as well as UN agencies in the monitoring effort and in further developing strategies on specific programs. Together with solidarity, we can build a better and a more equal Asia-Pacific. So now I will hand over to my colleague Sarah to provide a summary of the other two sessions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and good morning and good evening to those of you that are in different time zones as well. I can only echo Chai in saying this has been a really very energetic and valuable set of discussions that we've been having together over the last 2 days. I'm just amazed by how much interaction we can have even when we're in this virtual world, and I see that even as I'm speaking there are more ideas coming in across the chat. So thank you everyone for making this such a positive and energetic and thoughtful environment. So I'm going to begin first of all just to say that this is of course a summarized set of recommendations. We will elaborate these more in the report. But I just want to present some of the key ideas. So starting with session 3, which was focusing, as you know, on freedom from violence, stigma, harmful stereotypes, and negative social norms, with a strong focus on the situation of violence against women during COVID. So first of all, a very clear message that came out of the session Violence against women is linked to women's economic status and empowerment, poverty reduction, social protection, and workplace policies. So we need to make this issue part of economic recovery plans and link it also to prevention approaches. This is not something that we can take in a vertical way and take in isolation from other issues. Secondly, our panelists made it clear that prevention of violence against women is possible. This remains relevant both during times of development and during emergencies. We know that there are approaches that work, we have evidence, and we really, really need to build on that. Thirdly, the colleagues emphasized that CEDAW and the Beijing Platform for Action need to continue to be used to provide direction and ways of holding governments accountable, and of course for governments internally to hold themselves accountable for their progress. I'd also like to add that a very key point that was raised was around services. So services that respond to violence against women and also reproductive and sexual health services are essential life-saving interventions. And this needs to be part of our response to emergencies and pandemics, as well as in the normal run of things. And for these to be effective, of course, they need to be resourced adequately. We need to keep a focus on the intersectional needs of women throughout their life cycle to ensure a better reach of all women. And I think this intersectionality is something that has come up throughout all of our sessions. It's a very key point. It's also important for governments to communicate that they take violence against women seriously and to be clear on the approaches that are being supported. Responses to violence against women need coordination, and we need networks of service providers to allow countries to build centres of expertise and respond quickly in times of crisis, including for health, social welfare, police and justice systems. Next, we emphasise the importance of partnerships. As we saw the richness of many different sectors coming together in this meeting, partnerships between government, civil society, academia, private sector are needed to enable this work to be effective. And finally, a point emerged around caregiving, around understanding caregiving as an essential service and the need for local support systems to ensure the safety of women with disabilities and older women to safely access these services even during this crisis time. Okay, so those are the key points from our session focused on violence against women and discrimination. I'd like to also present a few key recommendations from the fourth and final session on environmental conservation, climate change and resilience building. So first, it was recognised in the session that in the context of this new reality, the efforts of government, civil society and private sector need to be addressed to include forward-looking, sustainable, environmentally ambitious and socially inclusive approaches in the COVID-19 recovery packages. And we need countries to ensure that the vast global fiscal support deployed to fight the pandemic also works to build a smarter, greener and more equitable future. I think we heard multiple of our panelists and those who intervened really talking about how we have to see the issues of COVID and the issues of climate as being connected, not taking them separately. So I think that point speaks very clearly to that. And a transformational recovery from the pandemic is only possible through coordinated action by all actors. So we have some specific recommendations also that we focused, that our participants focused on specific actors and sectors. So just to begin with recommendations more focused towards state actors. These looked at encouraging behavioural and cultural shift to promote women as holders of knowledge and agents of change. This is very important, not speaking simply about women as vulnerable people or victims, but understanding women's agency as part of this discussion. Secondly, making people the top priority in the COVID recovery packages, taking into account unique knowledge and role of women in their communities, with full and equal leadership and participation of women at all levels. Third, building technical capacities and including women in decision-making processes to ensure the integration of gender perspective in environmental and climate policies and programs, and to encourage gender-responsive, risk-informed disaster prevention and preparedness systems. And finally, it's part of the responsibility of state actors also to be supportive of multilateralism and global perspectives in order to connect climate action, gender mainstreaming from national to global level and to work through partnerships. Secondly, a couple of recommendations that may be focused a little bit more on the complementary role of complementary role of civil society and of the private sector. So first, civil society should work with grassroots communities, national and provincial governments and other partners in developing gendered emergency and recovery response plans and incorporating greater protection and assistance for vulnerable groups in climate action. And finally, a recommendation specifically focused on the private sector. The recommendation that the private sector should focus on developing innovative business plans and gender equitable investment plans which are inclusive and climate resilient. So with that, I conclude the recommendations from our fourth session on climate change and DRR. And maybe Chai, I will hand back to you now for our last few moments.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'd now like to ask my colleague, Chana, who is monitoring the chat box, if there's any specific question at this point.
So we would like to invite participants now to any final reflections on the commentaries that were made here by our co-facilitators. We see some comments coming through with some suggestions. I will give it another few seconds before we start summing up on the possible questions. So there are concrete questions regarding a possible roadmap now towards the implementation of the Beijing+25 declaration. Particularly regarding partnership with civil society organizations. We have some questions around the follow-up actions and how will the meaningful CSO engagement be ensured in the next steps of implementing the Beijing+25 declarations. So there is some questions around other partnerships as well. Let me hand the floor back now to Sarah and Chai.
Okay, Sarah, maybe I briefly can address regarding the mechanism to address to engage the CSO, and then maybe Sarah could also share from the UN Women's side any specific modality, and also I think I saw there's also a specific question for UN Women in terms of supporting women in agriculture in partnership with IFAD and FAO. So broadly speaking, CSO engagement is of vital importance in the overall ESCAP roadmap of implementing the 2030 agenda. And this is already highlighted as a corporate strategy for UN system as a whole, but also as our overall strategy for roadmap on SDGs. And we are also working with member states in addressing these aspects. So the for now, I would just want to mention that we will work with all the divisions and especially utilize the ESCAP's Asia Pacific Forum for Sustainable Development as a main vehicle, because CSO engagement mechanism has been already established under this overall strategy. And we should, in order to truly mainstreaming gender into the 2030 agenda implementation, we should ride on this vehicle and make sure gender is put at the center in the roadmap for Asia Pacific as a whole. Thank you. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Chai. First of all, then maybe I would just take the specific question that came around engagement of UN Women with UN partner agencies around agriculture, and just to say yes, there are a number of engagements in different countries in the region with IFAD, FAO, and other relevant agencies. And this is particularly, I would say, as part of the socioeconomic response plan that you may be aware UNCTs are currently supporting governments with as part of the UN response to COVID. And I think this has really encouraged actually some new partnerships and some new efforts. And please feel free to reach out to UN Women to find out more about that. I would like to just very much support also Chai Chai's commitment. Is very much a commitment of UN Women also around the engagement of CSOs in the continuing efforts to put our Beijing+25 commitments into action. This is both as part of the regional mechanism that Chai Chai has already outlined, but also parts of UN Women's work at country level as well, where there are various ways and modalities in which UN Women is working with networks of civil society at the national level and encouraging their engagement. And I would also just like to really acknowledge the comments that I saw coming on the chat about intersectionality and about questioning norms and remaining aware of the importance of intersectionality. And I think this is something that we can all always be reminded of and do better, but is something that we are striving to integrate in our work with CSOs. So that's my responses for now. May I just check with Chanay and Chai Chai if we have anything else that we are able to respond to that's come across the chat at the moment?
I think it looks there are no specific questions. I'm sorry. I don't see any specific questions at this point. I think given that we are over time already, and perhaps we will try to summarize to our best, to the best extent, and share the report with the participants soon. Dear participants, thank you very much for your wonderful contributions to this expert group meeting, as well as a dialogue. And this is really important in helping shape up the strategy in moving forward on implementing the Beijing+25 review outcomes. And as I mentioned earlier, we will continue this dialogue with you, not just this year, but in the coming years. And at this point, I also want to thank the joint organizing team of ESCAP and UN Women. And I think this exemplifies the partnership we have highlighted and how the two agencies come together in brainstorming, in setting up the agenda, in identifying the experts, and also in preparing all the meeting materials and documents. So thank you, dear colleagues, for your hard work behind the scenes. It is really amazing how you worked day and night in putting this together. Before we finally conclude, may I invite Shanae to mention a few specific logistical issues? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chai Chai. The last thing on the agenda now is just for us to put a photo in our memory box. We would like to take a virtual group photo now. And for that to happen, we would like to request all of you to turn on your video. Please keep your microphones muted. And we have about 60 participants in the meeting now. I can see on my screen that the gallery view is changing. I think we may need to take 3 or 4 separate screenshots. So if you'll just bear with us while we capture you, you can start smiling now, I think. And if you can hold this smile for us for a couple of minutes, I'm going to get a cue from my colleague, I think, when we are all said and done. And so just to ask you once again to please complete our evaluation form. It was circulated in the chat box towards the end. I will send the link again. It is important for us to hear your feedback, especially in view of this new way of organizing meetings, how we can improve these in the future. And We will be uploading all the presentations from the sessions 3 and 4 today as well on the website link that was provided earlier. And we will also be uploading the meeting reports to this link. Many resources were shared and we will make sure these were included as well. Many promising practices were shared. These will be summarized in the meeting report too. Let's see if we have, yes, we need another couple of minutes. So we have a few participants who have not turned on their cameras yet. May we kindly ask you to do so? Thank you very much.
I don't know what is on the screen now. Maybe we take several. Would that work? Yeah. So more people come. Yeah, maybe Shona, what do you think? Is this what we can get? Can close it, and after that another batch. Would that work? Let me just take this last week, and then we say that I think about 6.
Okay, we are almost done on this side, I'm being told. Thank you for holding your smiles handy for us. We will share these with you in our follow-up message with the meeting report as well. So here in Bangkok, it's lunchtime. It may be morning, afternoon, late evening for you. Thank you very much once again for your participation and your commitment to advancing gender equality in the Asia-Pacific region. We are grateful for your participation and your commitment and look forward to working with you in the coming days and months ahead. Thank you very much again. This concludes our meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.